Total War Warhammer 3 will take us to a whole new portion of the Warhammer map, the Darklands. In our coverage of the Darklands, we discussed the dense variety of races that dot the map, but one race stands out quite literally above the rest, the Ogre Kingdoms. Spanning almost the entirety of the northeastern portion of the Darklands, the Ogre Kingdoms fill up the Mountains of Mourn. Kingdom only in name, Ogres are each part of an individualistic tribe with their own loyalties, traditions, and fighting for the most part. But every race in the Warhammer world has an origin story, and it's most often tied to the Old Ones. The very same is true for the Ogres. We know the stories of the Old Ones, how they created the Lizardmen, and then the Elves who were too sensitive to the winds of magic, and then the Dwarves who were too resistant to the winds of magic, while also being stubborn and unchanging. Shortly after, they created men, who could succumb too willingly to the whims of chaos. The Old Ones' plan was to create a race that could effectively act as soldiers for them in their fight against chaos. Enter the Ogres, able to wield magic like the Elves, but resist it to an extent like the Dwarfs. As adaptable as the Lizardmen, but as quick to reproduce as the humans. The Ogres were the perfect fit. Except, of course, for their voracious hunger and otherwise dull wit. But before the Old Ones could finish their easy-bake oven ogre creations, chaos attacked. So the one race that was best suited for winning against chaos was not able to come to the fore, and the Old Ones weren't able to curb either their hunger or shockingly poor grasp on anything said to be intellectual. Thus, we have the Ogres of today. The history of the Ogres is not the overall focus of this video, but I think it's absolutely worth touching on. Ancient Ogres used to be tall, lean, and muscular. Their lasting war with Cathay resulted in Cathay pulling a celestial, I'm going to say quote-unquote being on this one, down from the heavens, crashing into the Warhammer world, instantly killing almost all the Ogre populace. I personally think it was a meteor, but the book makes it sound to be a little bit not so much like that. But this being is worshipped as the Great Maw by the Ogres. It is also the reason their already insatiable hunger is even greater than it was before. I actually personally think it was a warpstone meteor because they worship the crater. And the actual impact of this tossed a shit ton of magic up into the air. And I say magic in the way that warpstone kind of has magic attached to it. But after this, the Ogres ascended the most ancient of mountains, discovered the realms of the Sky Titans, these massive ancient beings that are many, many, many times larger than anything in the Warhammer world. The subsequent War in the Sky, as it is called, saw the Sky Titans wiped out for the most part, and the Ogres moving down and westward into the Mountains of Mourn, where their massive tribes are today. And if you're wondering what happened to the few remaining Sky Titans, you can look to the Giants. They're the inbred, dwarfed result of generations of Sky Titan inbreeding. Yummy. But with that established at least, we can get into the meat and potatoes of the Ogre Kingdom army list. And this will be an army that is vastly different than any army we have seen before it. Let's dive in on some of the army mechanics before going into the list as a whole. Because every single army in Warhammer Fantasy Battles has got specific special rules that apply to them. And we've gone over those rules with each one of our list videos before. But a good example would be Martial Prowess for the High Elves or Murderous Prowess for the Dark Elves. These make up essentially the backbone of how an army is played. The Ogre Kingdoms have plenty of special rules that apply to them, and some that are entirely unique to their units that no other faction has. But we'll talk about those rules as we get into the individual units that have them. The biggest standout mechanic is Ogre Charge. Ogres are so thunderously large, with such a gigantic gut of pure muscle and fat, that when they charge into combat, they pile in gut first. And this was so important on the tabletop because it was the only way that the slow, low weapon skill army of the Ogres could do considerable damage to an army of, say, Elves, with their always strike first mechanic. Now, in Warhammer 3, that won't be as crucial to the survival of the Ogres like it was in tabletop, since always strike first and initiative aren't a thing. But I still expect some glorious thunder charges. I want to see dwarf beards crack upon these bellies like an egg being speed chucked at a granite countertop. So I expect this to look like something of a massive charge bonus for every Ogre unit on their charge. And they obviously won't have the ability to cycle charge because they'll be slower on their feet. But there is also a worry that you'll just be able to path your ogres through every army and into the back line. Effectively, you could kind of like double stack these units, having one path through while another fights the main force. Creative Assembly is going to have to really tweak with the way mass works in Warhammer 3 if they don't want ogres to just abuse this defining characteristic. Now, much like the dwarfs have their runes and master runes, ogres have big names. Of course, quote unquote big names, like that's the name of the mechanic, is big names. Of course, we don't see runes really make their way into selectable options for lords and thanes like it is in tabletop. But the big name system, I think, it's pretty easy to incorporate. Essentially, there are a number of these big names in the army book that a hero or lord can select along with their magic items. And I could see these being implemented into the game as either skills on a skill tree that are locked out. Once you choose one, it locks out the rest. Or they're the traits that a lord has when you bring up the recruitment window. So they're randomly generated. One, for example, would be Wall Crusher, meaning that they do more damage from their ogre charge. But maybe this could also mean the hero or lord has the innate Siegebreaker ability of Warhammer, or Total War Warhammer. Longstrider is another one that increases movement speed. Giant Breaker gives an increase to strength, so we can see that being equated to melee or weapon strength. But all manner of fun names to choose from that I think really make up a lot of the character of the Ogre Kingdom army. With these mechanics in mind, we can start to discuss the army list as a whole. And we'll do this as we always have. We'll talk about the in-book lore blurb from the 8th edition army book, then go into how this could possibly be incorporated into Warhammer 3. And we'll go through the entire book, starting with the lords, moving all the way down to the rare choices. One thing that's worth pointing out before we jump into the Tyrant, our first lord, is how skewed the army list is. Generally, you have a lot of troop choices, a fair amount of special choices, and a few rare choices. For the ogres, it's the other way around. You have only 3 troop choices, and arguably one of the largest list of rare choices in the game. And no one's talking about you, Chaos. Sit back down with your multi-god bullshit. We know, you have greater demons. You'll get your own video, don't worry. But let's get started on our journey into the Ogre Kingdoms. So our first lord choices, again, the Tyrants. Ogres call the leaders of their tribes Tyrants, and it is easy to see why. Tyrants are the biggest and strongest individuals in a hulking race that prides itself on these physical features. To claim rulership over a group of ogres requires a mighty brawler, a creature powerful enough to wrestle a giant to the ground, or smash his way through a fortified gate using only his bare fists. An ogre tyrant uses his tremendous size and brawn to dominate, earning the right to command the tribe by displaying prodigious feats of what the ogres respect the most: strength, violence, extraordinary girth, and a healthy, all-consuming appetite. The title of Tyrant is not a hereditary one. To become a tribe's Tyrant, an ogre simply has to beat the existing Tyrant in single combat, usually done in traditional one-on-one, guts-out fights in the maw pit before the assembled tribe. These conflicts are no-holds-barred displays of bone-crunching violence. A challenge to a Tyrant's authority can result in one of 2 fates for the challenger. If all goes well for the pretender to the throne, he will beat the incumbent Tyrant and consume his broken body, taking his place at the head of that kingdom. If the Tyrant proves stronger, it is the contender who is beaten down and messily devoured. The way ogres see it, such a battle is unrivaled entertainment, and one of the 2 fighters will get a good meal to boot. Some of the oldest and longest serving tyrants are known to sit upon thrones made entirely from the bones of those foolish enough to challenge their rule over the years. As the dominant male of the tribe, a tyrant will frequently sire a host of strong offspring. The whelps of the largest ogres usually grow to a maximum size as well. Thus, it is not uncommon for a tyrant to face his progeny in the maw pit, and a successful tyrant will often devour several of his own young over the years. All ogres are greedy, but none more so than a tyrant. A gnawing hunger drives ogres to feats of greed, and nobody embodies this insatiable, gluttonous behavior more than a tyrant. The longer he holds the title of tyrant, the more ravenous an ogre leader becomes, and a tyrant's desires go beyond just food, to also include hoarded wealth and power. The longer they rule, the more tyrants become consumed with their status. To this end, the massive rulers accrue the best war gear in the tribe, often outlandishly large weapons and cumbersome armor. A tyrant's gut plate must not only cover his prodigious stomach, but also be more impressive than anyone else's. Beyond elaborate arms and armor, ogre tyrants can think of little else to spend their plunder on. However, this does not stop them from adding to their stash. Even when a tyrant has filled his hidden hoard cave, he will still readily go to war to snatch up yet more. Tyrants use boastful titles as the latter part of their names, indicating particular accomplishments during their ascent to the throne. As a successful tyrant's reign of bloodshed extends, so does his name, often resulting in long lists of great, violent superlatives. Take the now legendary off-flab Stonecrusher Fat Gut Death Cheater, an ogre who remained tyrant of his kingdom for over 90 years before choking to death on his great-grandson's skull. So you really get this culture from the ogre kingdoms that is somewhat reminiscent to the greenskins, if not even more bestial than they are. So it's a really kind of it's a Wild West over there in the far east of the Darklands, and these guys are massive. They're these huge, monstrous creatures, right? But what I find kind of interesting about all the tyrants and all the heroes, all the lord and hero choices of the ogre kingdoms is that there's only one hero choice that can choose a mount. The rest can't. So the ogre tyrant here is not going to be seen on any kind of mount unless Creative Assembly wants to choose to put them on a mount. So these tyrants, although they are these all-powerful creatures, in a game where mounts are kind of king, it's interesting that their innate power is kind of curbed by that ability to not even jump on a mount. So it's kind of interesting. But ogres as a whole, and this is something we haven't really talked about, have a huge amount of wounds and attacks. In the tabletop, an ogre tyrant has 5 wounds and 5 attacks, and toughness 5, meaning that majority of things can't even hit him at a substantial enough threshold to do much damage. And on top of that, he has so many wounds that he can just soak up hits. That's what makes the ogres so strong, is that they have a very high, I guess you could call it a health pool, if we're making the equivalency over to Total War Warhammer. Because their wounds are so high, they have such a small amount of units or models per unit. So this kind of balances that out. But the ogre tyrant themselves are quite interesting because you have access to a lot of different weapons, right? You have a great weapon, you have access to an additional hand weapon, you have access to pistols. So that leads me to believe that an ogre tyrant, when incorporated into Total War Warhammer, will have the same kind of mechanics we see with other lords, having a split choice wherein you can choose, hey, and this is a hybrid range lord, or this is a melee-centric lord. And I see that same kind of focus coming to the fore here with tyrants, having them have braces of pistols that allow them to just do a lot of AP range damage, or great weapons allowing them to just do a crap ton of melee AP damage. So it's really going to come down to however they translate this into the game, but I think that we'll see the typical split like we usually do, and they'll cover it from there. Outside of that, the Ogre Tyrant doesn't really have any special rules. I mean, it's got Fear built into its profile, as well as Ogre Charge, but that's it outside of that. I mean, he can choose an Iron Fist, which is something I did want to talk a little bit about. The way an Iron Fist works is that it is a gauntlet that is basically put onto the arm of of an ogre. It's meant for pit fighting. That's where it actually comes from. But in the way that the tabletop looks at it looks at it as a shield. So you can actually use it to parry things, and it can block things, so it increases your armor save. So I wonder if we'll be seeing this in Total War Warhammer in the way that we would a normal shield. So if I take a Tyrant and I decide to give him an Iron Fist, or maybe that's an option, or however that is done, because there are many units in the Ogre roster that can select Iron Fists as a choice for them. So does that stand to reason that the Iron Fist will then confer a range defensive bonus for the Tyrant? Will it give him a quote-unquote bronze shield, as it refers to the range missile defense of small arms fire against the Tyrant? I would think so, because that's the way that it's supposed to be equated in the tabletop. It's supposed to just be simply a shield. And these things aren't small. It's a big, huge blob of metal on a big, huge meat hook that is the Ogre's hand. So I'd be interested to see how they do that. But let's move on over to the other lord in the Ogre Kingdom army list. Now this will actually be a double entry because the Slaughtermasters and the Butchers are both covered together. The Slaughtermasters are the Lord choice of the caster unit for the Ogre Kingdoms, and the Butchers are the hero choice. Ogres approach magic and the worship of their gods in ways that are not easily understood by outsiders. Within an Ogre tribe, it is a Butcher who takes the role of both wizard and prophet, for he alone has a direct link to the Great Maw. Through the gory ritual preparation and consumption of meat, Butchers channel a portion of their fearsome deity's eternal hunger into feats of magic. Invoking the single-minded strength of their god, Butchers can instill unnatural vitality to their comrades, swelling the ogre's muscles and toughening their skin. They can even turn their wrath upon the enemy, causing bones to break or the ground to open up and swallow their foes. Although not as mighty as a Tyrant, a Butcher is an emissary of the Great Maw and is held in both awe and fear by his tribe. Butchers prepare all of a tribe's feasts, celebrations in which all ogres take great pride. Around camp, a Butcher is given a wide berth, for it is best not to get close in case he is looking for extra ingredients, as fingers or whole limbs have been known to go missing. In battle, however, Butchers are most often found right in the thick of the fighting, where they use their cleavers and magic to great effect. Butchers are typically more rotund than an average ogre and have even worse personal hygiene. They often resemble walking larders, where in addition to being caked in dried blood and offal, Butchers adorn themselves in chunks of meat, along with an array of meat hooks, cleavers, flaying knives, and even special tenderizers tucked into a leather apron, or even pierced through their own flabby skin. A Butcher must be prepared to use these items in their gore-soaked rituals at a moment's notice. Of all true ogres, only the Butchers do not wear a gut plate. They trust their guts to the protection of the Great Maw. Any infant that conforms to the recognized portents is immediately handed to the tribe's Butcher, who bites deep into the whelp's gut to claim it as his own. The Butcher then force feeds the child in a continual glut until the protege has grown fat and strong. Further initiations into the secrets of the Great Maw include gulping down rotten meat and toxins to build up a tolerance to poison, learning the art of grinding bones to meal, and discovering which parts of a beast to devour to augment different magics. Some Butchers show an inclination towards magics other than the Great Maw. Some take powers from the very animals they cull, while others who dream of an oncoming fiery comet have a penchant for reading the future and controlling the weather in destructive ways, whilst always looking to the heavens for some skyborne disaster. Still, other Butchers revel in the final act of their killing work, and their spells focus on death and dying. Regardless of their focus, ogres believe that to cross a Butcher is to cross the Great Maw itself, a certain recipe for a painful doom. The largest, most fearsome, and most powerful Butchers are given the additional title of Slaughtermaster. And there are few things that walk or crawl that such expert killers have not chopped up and prepared for a ritual feast. So, pretty intense, I will say. Good God, Martha, I don't quite like the sound of these Butchers. But they're a really thematic cast of the Ogre Kingdoms, and we haven't really talked much about the gut plate, but if you want to think of it as certain ancient civilizations or certain fantastical civilization, like the Dothraki, for example, their braid is like a mark of honor, right? Well, it's the same thing with the gut plate for ogres, and to not have a gut plate is either dishonorable and you're like a cur, like, don't trust that asshole, or you're obviously a Slaughtermaster and or Butcher. So those gut plates are pretty important, and you will hear them talked about more and more as we go through the lore of the Ogre Kingdoms here. But the Slaughtermaster / Butcher can be a number of lores of magic. They can be the lore of Great Maw, which we've covered in an additional video that should pop up in the upper right corner here. The lore of heavens, lore of beasts, lore of death, just in the same way the lore just basically described all 4 or 3 of those total lores. Now, in the tabletop, you cannot have a caster in your army if one is not dedicated to the lore of the Great Maw. It's the exact same way that the Tomb Kings have to have a lore of Nehekara caster in order for them to even field their army. So I don't imagine that will make a translation into this game. It's been pretty obvious that Total War Warhammer has kind of thrown that out. I mean, we've seen the Tomb Kings without the lore of Nehekara, so don't expect that to make the translation here. But for the most part, This is a pretty standard caster character. It's more in line, though, with a Famir Bale Fiend than it is with just, say, like an Empire Wizard. These guys are no slouches. I mean, they do have a Strength 4 and Toughness 5, but they're very stalwart in combat. They have 5 wounds for the Slaughtermaster, 4 for the Butcher, and 4 attacks for the Slaughtermaster with 3 for the Butcher. Of course, they suffer from the same weapon skill as just your rank and file, but these guys are not really meant to deliver damage in melee as much as they are to just bring down the house when it comes to magic. And the lore of Great Maw is a really, really fun lore. Check out that video on it because it covers a lot of elements of a lot of other lores to make it a viable lore that you need to take. It takes some things from the lore of life. Like if we take a look at this portion of the lore here, let me see. Invoking the single-minded strength of their god, butchers can instill unnatural vitality to their comrades. That's the healing portion. Blowing the ogre's muscles and toughening their skin, increases strength and toughness through one of their spells. They can even turn their wrath upon the enemy, causing bones to break or even the ground to open up and swallow their foes. So they have got some direct damage spells in there as well. So it's actually a pretty cool mixed lore that I think was actually going to get a lot of play in the competitive realm as well as campaign. I think you're not going to look at the lore of Great Maw and go, oh fuck no, I don't want that. So I'm excited to see how much of a hybrid caster / melee character they make these guys. If they're going to be dedicated solely to being offensive, or if they're going to be, if they're going to be dedicated solely to casting, or if they're going to have some actual characteristics of them that's maybe towards casting or melee. Because the other unit we're going to talk about in the hero section, the Firebellies, are, in my mind, a lot more of an actual caster with some additional caveats attached to them. But let's jump on over, on that note, let's jump on over to the hero section. That sums up our lore choices with the Tyrant and the Slaughtermaster. Let's jump on over to that one right now. And the first hero on our list of heroes is the Bruiser. Aside from the Tyrant himself, a tribe's Bruisers are the most imposing ogres in terms of sheer size and strength, and are often related to the kingdom's ruler. Bruisers usually act as enforcers or under chieftains, and they spend a great deal of their time smashing and pummeling in the name of their tyrant. As payment for using their fighting skills and brawn, Bruisers have many privileges in the tribe. Not least of these is the license to smack 7 shades of dung out of any ogre not towing the line, not eating messily enough, or spending too much time playing with his Gnoblars. This bullying behavior doesn't make them popular with the rest of the tribe, though most ogres have learnt that it's better to keep their mouth shut, at least while the Bruiser is within hearing distance anyway. Occasionally an ogre will fight back, and in the unlikely event that he wins the resulting brawl, he will be allowed to take the Bruiser's place. This right of challenge serves to keep the Bruisers in line, and ensures that they don't take too much advantage of their privileged position. In battle, it is the Bruisers who generally maintain discipline within the ogre ranks when the Tyrant's eye is elsewhere. Physically massive, many Bruisers will seek to grow their reputations by performing great feats of slaughter upon a battlefield. Nothing suits a Bruiser better than being the one who single-handedly turned a fight around. Stopping a chariot with their bellies, breaking entire formations by themselves, or squishing the life out of the enemy's mightiest champions are amongst the deeds that a Bruiser must do to build up his name. With the exception of the Tyrant, Bruisers get the pick of the spoils and equip themselves with the best gear of war, including outlandish items plundered from afar. Occasionally, a Bruiser will place a leadership challenge to the incumbent Tyrant, but it is equally common for a Bruiser to be content with the pure violence of his position without the hefty burden of non-gut related decision making. Some Tyrants prefer Bruisers that are no more than huge, muscle-bound thugs with no ambition and the brains and temperament of a Rhinox. Not all Bruisers are simple-minded brutes, however. Many are veterans of dozens of campaigns who have traveled through the old world and beyond, learning the hard way of what works on the battlefield and what does not. These veterans have seen it all and are content to act as loyal advisors and henchmen to the Tyrant. He, in his turn, is grateful to have at least 1 or 2 followers he can trust to do the right thing at the right time. Top fighting Bruisers are often found as the captains of mercenary bands of ogres, having enough intelligence and experience to negotiate a good deal, while still having the brute strength needed to make sure the rest of the crew do exactly as they are told. Bruisers are sometimes entrusted with the tribe's standard, a massive banner hung with trophies and tokens of the tribe's bloodiest victories and accomplishments, symbols that rouse great feelings of pride and aggression in his fellow ogres. These banners are so robust that they are often used as weapons themselves. Having a metal-bound pole smashed into your head by a Bruiser will hurt no matter what's hanging from it. So these guys are pretty fucking cool, right? I really like the imagery behind Bruisers because they kind of fall in line with either like, hey, we are the second hand to a Tyrant, or maybe we're just a very opportunistic mercenary captain. And that's something I want to talk about a little bit with a mechanic I have in mind for the Ogre Kingdoms. If you saw that video on He Who Shall Be Not Named, because I don't want to get demonetized, Legendary Lord of the Ogres, something Maneater, you heard my idea about mercenary stance. And I think that this would make a lot of sense for the Ogre Kingdoms as a whole, maybe rather than just one Legendary Lord. And my idea for mercenary stance is you can place a character in another faction's territory, and when you do that, they will, or I'm sorry, an army in another faction's territory, an allied faction's territory. Sorry, I forgot that part. When you do that, they'll take attrition, but they'll gain income. So basically thinking of it as the opposite of raiding something, right? So rather than not taking attrition when you're raiding something and gaining income, you're going to gain more income than if you had been raiding, and you're going to take attrition damage to represent that your army is out fighting, it's doing the deed for that ally you've put it with, so that might gain, maybe it can gain them magic items, stuff like that, but I think it'd be a really cool way to play into this whole mercenary trope that is so big with ogres, especially with Bruisers. You hear how their entire lore goes, but I think as a whole, it would make for a really cool kind of characteristic for the army itself or for the faction itself. Now, Bruisers can, of course, they can be battle center bearers. We do know that that is not a thing, unfortunately, and much to my chagrin. But what I will say is that we've seen that the Bruisers can also be equipped in the number of the ways that Tyrants can. So maybe we can see Bruisers with additional hand weapons, or Bruisers that have great weapons, or Bruisers that have abrasive pistols. That's what I think is going to be unique with both the Tyrant and the Bruiser, is just the amount of functionality, or I guess like kit ability, customization, I guess you could say, because in tabletop, the Bruiser himself can have an Iron Fist, which we've talked about, a great weapon, a single Ogre pistol, or abrasive Ogre pistols, or an additional hand weapon. And you can choose between light or heavy armor. So if you wanted to make, I would assume that Creative Assembly would make like, okay, if it's going to be the ranged abrasive pistol Lord, it's going to be a light armored Lord. Versus, say, the Iron Fist and additional hand weapon, or a great weapon Lord would be the heavy armored variant. So that's kind of how I would see them doing the Bruiser. And of course, same thing for the Tyrant, no crazy special rules, just simply that it has Fear and Ogre Charge. Let's move over to the other caster for the Ogre Kingdoms and talk about that hero choice. Now, the other caster are the Firebellies. Firebellies are the roaring, blazing priests of the Ogre deity known as the Fire Mouth. Quick to mirth and anger alike, Firebellies are garrulous and vital individuals who are readily welcomed into any Ogre tribe. Fire burns within these larger-than-life prophets in a literal as well as metaphorical sense. Bald and broad, their ruddy skin glows from within, and their bare chests are tattooed extensively with symbols of destruction. When a Firebelly's wrath is roused, he can breathe out a cloud of billowing flame so fierce that it can melt through chainmail in seconds. Firemouth is the largest and most powerful volcano in the mountains of Mourn. It is an important figure in Ogre mythology, revered alongside the Great Maw by all Ogres and worshipped fervently by those tribes that have witnessed the violence of its mighty eruptions firsthand. Every year, dozens of Ogre pilgrims flock to the sides of the Firemouth and announce their presence to the small but influential tribe that makes its home in caves nestled into the volcano's slopes. As magma courses down the sides of the Firemouth like drool from a butcher's gob, the aspirants dare to undergo the grueling flame trial, a mysterious ritual held by the Firebelly tribe as their volcano god rumbles in his sleep. As with all other religious occasions in the Ogre Kingdoms, this trial by fire begins and ends with the act of ingesting something. First, the hopeful Ogre must gobble down an entire cauldron full of flame toad and devil pepper curry, a repugnant mixture also useful for ending protracted sieges. Even as his gut burns, he must then catch one of the cart-horse-sized fire beetles that burrow through the lava streams and devour the critter in a single sitting. It is the final task, however, that is deadliest of all. Before being accepted and becoming a Firebelly, the aspirant must drink the blood of the fire mouth. The supplicant first climbs atop the caldera of the titanic volcano. The sight of the lake of bubbling, hissing magma below is impressive enough to take the breath away, even before the sulfurous stench assails the nostrils. Many contenders flee at this point, but those with the courage to continue are slowly lowered on thick chains inside the mouth of the volcano. The heat is such that their hair is burnt from their bodies, and their eyes boil in their sockets, but the truly faithful will persevere, scooping up a skull full of roiling lava. After being hauled back up to the top of the edge of the fire mouth, the ogre must gulp the molten rock down in a single draught. This last act is lethal even for the most gastronomically inviolable ogre. Only those with the blessing of the volcano can survive. The survival and subsequent initiation of a new Firebelly happens perhaps a few times every decade, and often coincides with a major outburst of flame from the firemouth itself. This is seen as a sure signal that it is time to make war on the lands of the weak, with the size of the battles to come coinciding with the strength of the eruption. In war, the Firebellies are well equipped to aid the ogres, for the disciples of the volcano inherit supernatural powers. Firebellies bear a measure of protection against the fiercest flames, can breathe out an inferno upon their foes, and can even cast and control flaming spells. The Firemouth has only a few priests on hand at any time, for they are never many and most of their kind journey alone into the Ogre Kingdoms. There, a Firebelly will join a tribe for a time, spreading the creed of their molten-hearted god and bringing fiery destruction to their foes. They are lively and popular transients and fill ogres full of wonder, with the ability to bleed magma and cause a wreath of flames about their bodies, with each burst of explosive flatulence. That is a doozy, holy crap. This is the only caster in the Ogre Kingdom that could take advantage of the lore of fire, if that wasn't already obvious. In addition, they've got flaming attacks, they've got their ogre charge, they've got fear. So you can kind of think of these guys as a Famir Balefiend with the lore of fire, but with rather than having their patented curse attacks, I can't think of the name off the top of my head, they've got flaming attacks. They also have the blessing of the volcano god. A Firebelly receives a 4-up ward save against any attacks that have the flaming attack special rule. I would simply look at this maybe as a fire resistance in their profile, because we don't see any ward saves that are specific to certain scenarios in Total War Warhammer, and if there are, they're so far and few between that I think that this would be a little too much of a niche situation. But they also have fire breath, which is kind of cool. So I would picture them having the same exact breath attack of Throg, but it being fire rather than it being a belch of vomit. So Firebellies, I think, are a pretty cool and interesting caster choice because they bring a different lore to the table in the lore of fire, and they've got a lot of really interesting attack characteristics as an individual jumping into the fray. With 4 wounds and 3 attacks, these guys are still able to dish out quite a bit of damage, and in my experience from tabletop, they were super annoying. Let's jump over to the very last hero choice of the Ogre Kingdoms, and one that is different than all the other ones we've talked about so far, which is the Hunter. Ogre hunters are solitary wanderers, outsiders from their own tribe or perhaps even exiles. Those that survive become fiercely independent warriors and savvy stalkers of beasts. Bereft of a tribe's protection and beefy companionship, the lone hunter must learn to track and kill, while simultaneously not becoming prey to any ferocious beasts. It is all too common for the hunter to become the hunted. To ward off the severe cold of high altitude, hunters dress in layers of skins and pelts, and also can be recognized for their tendency to carry an arsenal of weapons, trapping gear, and skinning knives. When one's days are spent stalking ogre-eating carnivores, it is best to be prepared. Hunters are incredibly proficient with their specialized gear, able to kill beasts on the move even at range. A hunter must learn how to best stalk his quarry. Each beast is formidable in its own right, and a hunter must discover techniques to deal with monstrous creatures of all sorts. For instance, it takes great patience to creep into an ambush position near the caves of the great bear-like crag beasts, while it takes fast-paced, double-tracking trickery to throw off a pack of Sabretusks once they have caught your scent. Knowing how to escape the first blast of icy breath from a Frostdrake, or where to aim a throwing spear to best dispatch a Mournfang, are also lessons that a hunter must pick up quickly. All hunters must bear horrific scars suffered from their many battles with the monstrous denizens of the mountains. Those few errors that don't prove fatal still hurt. Although most no longer belong to a tribe, hunters periodically drag an impressive kill back to an ogre camp for a special feast day. Some hunters return to the tribe of their origins, while others wander throughout the kingdoms. Hunters are popular visitors, for not only do they drag down some of the largest carcasses, but they liven up any feast with their rich funds of stories about life on the mountaintops. The profusion of horrible scars and displays of beast skulls and impressive tusks also go a long way towards earning the respect of a local tribe. Before long, a hunter's solitary ways will take over, and he will amble back up to the slopes. So with hunters, you get definitely a more ranged character, and that's what I mean by this is a different one from what we've talked about with the Bruisers, with the Tyrants, with the Slaughtermasters, and the Butchers, which are, quite honestly, just simply melee hybrid casters or just melee characters. With the hunter, you have this character that is, I guess, above a Norsekin hunter with a javelin, and below Orion, because he has this ability called the Great Throwing Spear. Hunters are armed with massive throwing spears, which they can hurl at an opponent. It's a short-range weapon, and it doesn't say it's got armor piercing on it or anything like that, but we've seen the way that a lot of this stuff kind of plays out in Total War Warhammer. So I would kind of equate this thing to an anti-large AP weapon that is going to be chucked at a semi-short range and is dealt, or is meant more for dealing a lot of that anti-large damage to creatures. Like we look at stuff like the nobles, right? The nobles of the High Elves are your anti-large kind of AP insurance that you can use in a way to defend your lord or mob up other characters. The hunter, I think, is going to fill that role. This AP anti-large character that has a somewhat moderate ranged ability that can then hunt things down. It does have an upgrade, though, called the Blood Vulture, and does have a little lore blurb for that, so let's read this. The Blood Vulture is a large, predatory bird that lives high in the mountains of Mourn. Although primarily scavengers, blood vultures have no qualms about attacking living creatures, swooping and slashing at their victims with their sharp claws and powerful beaks. Ogre hunters capture and tame blood vultures, and use them to hunt down prey or attack foes in battle. In the way that this is equated in tabletop, it's just simply a ranged weapon. So how would I see this converted, though, to Total War Warhammer? And I think it would make a lot of sense if this was something that you could use to kind of harass something and slow it down and reduce either its missile parry or its melee defense. Like, oh man, this blood vulture's in my fucking face. I have to bat this thing away the entire time. My defenses are kind of lowered. I guess I could, if I'm thinking of it from a thematic or from a narrative standpoint, that's how I could kind of look how the blood vulture could be incorporated into Total War Warhammer. Because we have so many hero characters that do have a lot of debuffs. Like when we take a look at anything in the Vampire Coastline, all their hero characters are just loaded to the brim with special abilities. And I think the hunter makes a lot of sense to have that. Now, as far as the war gear for the hunter, though, we were talking about the ability to mount things. Well, I mean mounts in the game, guys, calm down. The only character, hero and lord, that can choose a mount is the hunter, and it can choose a Stonehorn. And we'll get into that when we get into the rare section, but basically it's this gigantic stone Yeti mammoth beast. It's disgusting and beautiful all at the same time. So this character is the only one that can mount an actual monstrous beast. And unless Creative Assembly just wants to say, okay, we're going to give these beasts or these mounts to the Lord's choices anyway, damn what the Codex says or the Army Book says, this is the only way that you're going to get some sort of mount on a character, period. And I guess it could kind of make a lot of sense. It plays into the role of these guys. But in tabletop, they had a special rule called loner, meaning that they couldn't be with an additional unit unless it was a Stonehorn unit that they were joining. So I think that this was Games Workshop's way of saying, okay, since he cannot be in a unit and he is not really the most stalwart of combatants, let's have this be his way to really kind of ensure his place on the tabletop rather than just getting killed off quickly. Because he was 130 points. That's not something you want to just waste. You might as well get a butcher at 100 points and have the ability to cast and defend himself. So I think this was their kind of insurance for that. But he can choose like harpoon launchers, great weapons, iron fists, and additional hand weapons. So maybe the hunter himself, he's got his great throwing spear, which does a lot of AP anti-large damage. Well, maybe in addition to that, his close combat weapon is a great weapon. So he's always going to be just this AP powerhouse, or armor-piercing powerhouse, that is meant to kind of crack things open, but at the same time, he himself is a bit of a glass cannon. But that concludes all of our heroes now, so we can jump on over to the troop choices. And like I said, the troop choices are pretty slim. There's only 3 of them, so we're gonna speed this video up a little bit. I like to spend more time on the lords and heroes because I feel like they're very mechanic driven to the overall thematics of the army. When we talk about troops, special, and rare choices, we'll be pretty much just going through the lore blurb for the most part, and then just kind of saying, hey, this is probably what it'll be like. I think that the troop choices especially will be very, very transparent and a one-to-one translation into the tabletop, or I'm sorry, into Total War from the tabletop. So it should be pretty quick jumping through those. But let's just move on over to those troopy troops, which I guess I'm going to be sticking with. So our first one is the Gnoblars. Gnoblars are wicked creatures possessed of malicious but limited cunning. They are not too distant relatives of the goblins that plague the world and are similar to their green-skinned cousins in height, with most specimens standing a little taller than a man's waist. Gnoblars are cruel-minded and their ability to do harm is only limited by their lack in physical strength. Their gnarled bodies are topped with large, bulbous heads, and they have scrawny arms that end in wide, dexterous hands. Ogres tolerate Gnoblars in their camps, especially if they make themselves useful by carrying and fetching things. In battle, a large group of Gnoblars can be, if not exactly formidable, then at least a bit dangerous. They often take to the battlefield in the hope of stealing some particularly shiny thing before the corpse harvest. Gnoblar fighters arm themselves with an assortment of broken bottles, swords, spear tips, false legs, fang weasel teeth, pointy sticks, and rusty daggers. Basically anything they can get their grasping hands on. Most of the time, the Gnoblars will loiter behind the ogres, making threatening yelps while lurking back in safety. They can unleash a hail of sharp stuff, ranging from bristle hogs or sharpened horseshoes to jagged rocks. While short-ranged, such pointy rubbish can occasionally cause some real damage. In extreme circumstances, i.e. actual conflict, Gnoblar fighters will frenziedly jab their enemies in the nether regions with their weapons until they or the enemy stops moving. Every now and then, their sheer numbers enable them to pull foes down in a tide of snapping bites, stabby blades, and pure malice. When things do not go quite so well and they start to die in their droves, well, they're only Gnoblars. Some Gnoblars are known as trappers. These outgoing and vindictive Gnoblars are the largest of their kind, and delight in catching and torturing the small mammals that populate the foothills of the Ogre Kingdoms. Hunting is too sporting for these Gnoblars, who much prefer to trap their prey. To this end, they have perfected the art of laying out jagged man-snappers, pits lined with stakes, wickedly barbed nooses, and other cruel devices that will incapacitate the unwary. Once they have snagged something, they like to play with it, usually jabbing it with sharp sticks, before devouring it or bribing their masters with it as a light snack. They will attempt to capture or kill anything up to the size, and violent temperament, of a mountain goat. Gnoblar trappers decorate themselves in pelts and smell like they roll about in animal carcasses, which they do when no one is looking and then later vehemently deny. Nobody knows or cares why. No matter how many Gnoblars meet the endless variety of violent deaths promised by the hostile lands of the ogres, there always seems to be more to take their place, which means when ogres go to war, so do Gnoblars. It's rare for an ogre tyrant to trust Gnoblar to do anything important, especially in battle. Nonetheless, Gnoblars have their uses. A common tactic is to send them ahead of the army, so they can attack with missile fire, and perhaps even in close combat before they inevitably run away. Some tyrants even use them in hopes of exhausting an enemy's arrows, though this fact is never mentioned to them as part of their duties. But with Gnoblars, we see something very similar to the way that almost the peasant mobs work, or in Bretonnia, or the Skaven slaves, where they have the expendable characteristic, right? Where in tabletop it's called Beneath Contempt. The usual response to a fleeing Gnoblar is a hearty belly laugh or a high-pitched giggle. Gnoblars actually get a real kick out of watching their mates run away. So in tabletop, these guys don't cause panic if anyone flees around them. So it's the same thing like we would see in Total War Warhammer with anything that's expendable, right? Like with zombies, Skaven slaves, and the such, like I was just saying. So I see these guys as just your very basic peasant-style chaff unit. You just throw them in the front of your ogres to absorb shots, to kind of get better placement, intercept cav charges, and the such. Now, you can upgrade your Gnoblars to Gnoblar trappers. And how would that work? And I kind of really toiled on this. So, the way the mechanic is, I'll read this here for you. Some units of Gnoblars include Gnoblar trappers, mean-spirited green-skinned survivalists who specialize in fighting dirty. Every model in an enemy unit that successfully charges the Gnoblar's front must take a dangerous terrain test as soon as the charge is completed to represent the various traps set in front of the unit. So we don't have anything quite like that in Total War Warhammer, right? We don't have a trap mechanic. You could add that to the game, and sure, that'd be kind of cool, but it's extremely finicky, temperamental. I mean, it requires so much actual finesse to really pull off. So here's what I kind of thought. What if Gnoblar trappers operate very similar to Night Goblins in the sense that they always have stock, and they have charge defense versus all? Or maybe they don't have stock, and they have charge defense versus all, and if you charge into them, you get trapped. So basically kind of think of it like a contact effect, that if you charge into them, your unit can't simply cycle out of it. So if you have, just say like a unit of Empire Knights, oh, I see these chaffy Gnoblars, I'm just going to ride through them and break them and get rid of them on the battlefield. Well, what if they're Gnoblar trappers, and rather than being able to pull out of that engagement quickly, your whole unit is slowed as if hit by like a Melkoth misfying miasma, just like a 37% slow on it. Something like that to kind of slow things down and kind of pay homage to the Gnoblar trapper kind of moniker. And Gnoblars in tabletop were like 2.5 points. I think they are the cheapest unit you can buy in the entirety of the tabletop, which is funny because I believe that Ogre Kingdoms have the most expensive core units as well, with Ironguts at 43 points per model. So kind of an interesting juxtaposition. But I think that the Gnoblars are going to make a backbone of a competitive Ogre Kingdom army because they need to absorb a lot of shots that you don't want going into your more high-valued ogres. Let's jump over to two more of our troop choices, which are going to be very similar in playstyle, but I think as a whole will have very specific uses. The first of said unit is just simply titled Ogres. Big, brutish, and extremely violent, ogres are simple and straightforward creatures. They know what they want, and they use their brawn to take it. Ogres don't do contemplative head-scratching, preferring to smash things they don't understand. The bull charge forwards is their favored way to smash any opposition and greedily grab what they like. And what ogres want is power, respect, wealth, and perhaps most of all, an endless supply of meat to feast upon. It is the ogre way to take more than their share. In fact, the ogres have a bully mentality that pushes them to take as much as possible. The only way to stop their aggression is a show of superior force. As ogres are a bit slow on their uptake, it sometimes takes a few applications of that show of superior force, but they will eventually back down before a stronger opposition. Ogres exhibit a practical, if self-centered, approach to their lives. So long as they are doing well, then all is fine. This isn't saying that ogres are evil-minded beings or that they are good-hearted either. Ogres are just above, or perhaps beneath, morals altogether. Ogres are out for themselves, and their first and only inclination is to act in the way that will benefit them the most. If invaders attack a tribe from a neighboring kingdom, other ogre tribes might ally together to repel the attackers, or they might pile on and join the invading side. A third option, chosen by the most veteran tyrants, is that they might wait until both sides are weakened before smashing them both. Ogres are opportunists, and the choice depends on what offers the most reward for an acceptable risk. Ogres are not duplicitous, not because they feel such guile is wrong, but because they lack the quick wits or mental agility to think of such tricks in the first place. Ogres excel at fighting, and this, along with their greed and lack of concern about right or wrong, means that an ogre army is always ready for a battle against anyone, anywhere. History is replete with examples of ogres being paid to fight, and even sometimes being paid not to join a fray. When they do enter combat, ogres make frightening opponents, for they are savage and can sometimes devour the fallen where they lie. In the heat of battle, this horrifies their opponents, who must fight the blood-splattered vanquisher of their former comrades. Ogre weapons reflect much about the character of their owners, big, solid, and often exceptionally blunt. Although rusty blades are popular, most ogres prefer the club, which they wield to awesome effect with their great ham fists. Although cumbersome, a club delivers a reliable heavy blow, and will only break or splinter after a great deal of use. For most ogres, a club is not only his first weapon, but also his most trusted one. An ogre treats his club like an extra limb, and will only eat it in the most dire of circumstances. On the battlefield, ogres form up into blocky units, and the sweaty stink of a hulking formation is imposing in its own right. As a mirror image of their tribal life, the largest ogre in a unit is in charge, and if he is powerful enough, the title Crusher is applied to him. Some Ogre formations take pride in their past victories and carry a banner so that the rest of the tribe can recognize exactly who it is performing such great deeds of strength. These standard poles are ideal places to hang skulls, trophies, or other evidence of their battle prowess. Ogres are going to be, I think, really interesting on the battlefield because this is a monstrous infantry unit, right? It's going to have its fear, it's going to have its ogre charge, and I guess we can expand on ogres as a whole because we're going to be talking about non-stop ogres from this point forward. There's no other real big differences in this army list aside from Sabretusks and then 2 other non-ogre units, well, and giants, I guess, too. But ogres, I think, are going to be very different because we have to think of a mechanic on the battlefield that kind of plays to them, right? We see ogre charge as being one of those mechanics, but I think there has to be a little bit more. Maybe something that plays into their voracious hunger. Maybe the fact that they can stop what they're doing on the battlefield and eat things, and maybe that heals them. Maybe that's part of like an ogre rampage mechanic, wherein ogres, which actually have a pretty decent leadership, they have a 7 leadership in tabletop. They all have like a minimum like 3 wounds. They all have 3 or 4 attacks depending on their class. I'm sorry, they're like an ogre itself is 3. The sergeant, the crusher's got 4. I think what's really going to be the thing for them is like maybe they've got like an ogre rampage, like what we see with the lizardmen, right? Lizardmen get below a certain threshold and they rampage. That's not in tabletop. But maybe for ogres, their rampage, rather than running off, is that they stay where they're at, hunker down, and start eating corpses. So sure, they're exposed, and they can get countercharged or they can get shot up, but they're going to start healing once they reach back to a certain threshold. And maybe this can only trigger every certain amount of seconds. So let's just say, hypothetically, if an ogre unit reaches 20% health, they will go into a hunger frenzy. They'll bend over, wait, what? They'll start eating the corpses of everything around them, and they'll push themselves up to, just say, 35% health. And they can't trigger that hunger frenzy again for, let's just say, 90 seconds. I think that'll be a pretty interesting mechanic for the Ogre Kingdoms as a whole to kind of tie into their lore and give them a mechanic that's not just simply Ogre Charge, which really only relies on the charge. Most of the Total War Warhammer 2 races that we've seen have some sort of persistent battle effect. The Realm of Souls, Martial Prowess, Murderous Mastery, or Murderous Prowess, the Vampire Coast and their Gunpowder mechanic. And pretty much anything, or the Lizardmen and their Rampage mechanic, Scurry Away for Lizardmen, something, or for Skaven, something that constantly kind of rolls throughout the battle. Ogre Charge would only really make sense during the charge, and that's it. And infantry is not going to have the capability to cycle charge. Maybe the ogres will have the speed to be able to pull this off, but I think there has to be something that is constantly underlying the faction. And some sort of hunger mechanic, I think, plays very well into that. But that kind of sums up our ogres here. We'll move over to our other ogres on this list and wrap up our troop choices. But before we do that, real quick, I just remembered, the actual equipment options for the ogres is that they can either have an additional hand weapon or an Iron Fist. So remember, we talked about the Iron Fist kind of being their close combat shield, more or less. They can use it as a weapon. So maybe our ogre unit would have one unit that is just simply a hand weapon and an additional hand weapon, so like an anti-infantry kind of style, or a hand weapon and the Iron Fist to give it some defensibility against ranged attacks. That's how I think you probably get these ogres split into 2 separate units, like we see with so many other things with their shield and non-shield variants to kind of save you some money here and there. But let's jump on over to the Ironguts. Ogre Ironguts are the ogres of any given tribe that have the most status and the best armor and weapons. They go into battle armed with massive 2-handed weapons, be they enormous scimitars, rocks bolted to tree bows with iron club bands, or simply gigantic versions of the traditional ogre club. Ironguts wear large, ornamented gut plates to show off their elite standing, and cover their meaty arms and boulder-like heads in heavy armor plating cobbled together from various conquests over the years. Although not markedly superior in strength to their fellows, Ironguts are afforded great respect, as they are usually hand-picked by the Tyrant himself. For this reason, a unit of Ironguts may well include the Tyrant's immediate family, where another might be comprised of his favorite drinking cronies. That said, it is not unheard of for the bulk of some especially formidable ogre tribes to be made up of Ironguts. This is especially true amongst rich or powerful ogre tribes, who can afford the expensive equipment and weaponry needed to equip a unit of Ironguts. Very little can stand before a full-blooded Ironguts charge. Any enemy troops that aren't hurled to the ground by the impact of the collision are subsequently smashed, pulped, or hacked apart by the massive weapons the Ironguts carry. Any who survive the barrage of brutality risk being stomped into the dirt under by the Ironguts' metal-shod feet. Ironguts are often used to spearhead an important attack, or held in reserve by some tyrants and used to bolster the battle line. The common ogre saying when things are going badly is that it's down to the Ironguts. Regardless of when or where they are deployed or how badly they are outnumbered, there is always a chance such a rock-hard formation can batter their way to victory. At the Battle of Magma River, the Rock Splitter tribe was ambushed by a huge Skaven horde. Hemmed in on all sides and outnumbered hundreds to one, the Ogre army was being slowly driven back towards the river of red-hot lava from which the battle took its name. Just when all seemed lost, a furious charge by the army's Ironguts broke a hole in the Skaven line. Swinging to left and right, the Ironguts enlarged the breach while splattering gore in sweeping arcs. Realizing their center was gone beneath the battering swipes of the Ironguts, the entire Skaven army lost heart, turned tail, and bolted for it, securing both a great ogre victory and the ensuing feast of magma-roasted ratmen. It was a unit of Ironguts that broke through the gates when the ogres found a dwarf mine atop Crag Spike Peak. And it was the Ironguts that held on and finally defeated the black-armored warriors of chaos in the Battle of Bloody Ice, and drove back the northern tribes in the long year without sun. Perhaps because of exploits like these, Ironguts are typified by an unshakable belief in their own superiority. This stems from their undeniable power or prowess in battle, and also from the extensive eating contests that Ironguts go through to prove themselves. Such feats are both a crude type of an initiation ceremony for the unit, and also a chance to show off to the rest of the tribe during feasts. The Ironguts display their intestinal prowess by eating a range of unpalatable items ranging from rusty nails and hot gravel to iron-banded cartwheels and chainmail armor, which is particularly troublesome to chew. It was one of these contests that gave rise to the myth of when Bolgut fell ill, a favorite amongst ogre whelps due to its fanciful nature. After all, as everyone knows, there is very little an Irongut cannot digest. Ironguts are pretty cool because they're very similar to Black Orcs. I mean, through and through, just think of a Black Orc but an ogre. They have great weapons, they've got heavy armor. That's really it. There's nothing special about these guys outside of it. They're just going to be your standard heavy armor, great weapon infantry like we typically see. It's not going to be great axes, probably great clubs. That might be a thing. But they've got their ogre charge, they've got fear. They can take magic standards, but that's not going to be a thing here. But for the most part, Ironguts are pretty straightforward. They have a pretty cool lore, right? You got that down to the Ironguts, which is that nod to the Roman Legion. But as a whole, they're going to be, I think, if ogres are going to make up the backbone of just like your standard line troops, Ironguts are going to make up that strong center, and hopefully they'll get some sort of significant increase to their charge bonus as a fact of just being heavily armored. But that wraps up our troop choices. There's only 3, like I said, so now we can jump into the special units and start off to get into some of the big character of the Ogre Kingdom's army. And our first special unit is actually going to be our first dedicated range unit, the Leadbelchers. Ogres have long been on the receiving end of artillery fire, and they have grown to respect and admire its tremendous killing power. Indeed, such weapons are everything an ogre admires. They are big, loud, and have a tremendous ability to smash things. However, making any kind of cannon is beyond the ken of ogres, and for years they had to make do with the salvaged remnants from battlefields, ripped off their carriages and carried by the massive creatures like handguns. There are many ogre legends about these early pioneers in the art of gunnery, and the tales of the Loose-Tooth tribe and the army of Nuln, or the Iron Stompers and the attack on Carrick Unferth, are often the first to be told. Units bearing such looted weaponry were unreliable, but produced enough spectacular results that ogre tyrants were always greedily seeking to get their hands on more artillery pieces. It wasn't until the Ogre Kingdoms began to regularly trade with Chaos Dwarfs that specially forged barrels became readily available. Now, it is rare to see a tribe without a unit of Leadbelchers, the ogre term for both the weapon and the unit that carries them. Their potential to cause destruction and the sheer joyful noise of their blasts is simply too great for most ogre tribes to pass up. It is easy enough to spot ogres from a Leadbelcher unit, where their faces are scorched. They bear severe powder burns, regularly feature eye patches, and often resort to protective metal plates hammered into their faces. This is the legacy of the point-blank detonations and imperfect, if not downright clumsy, understanding of black powder. Regardless, these hardy and noticeably deaf ogres feel it is well worth sacrificing eyebrows, an eye, or even a few fingers for the chance to level such devastating weapons at a foe. In fact, Leadbelchers without some scorching or disfigurement are looked upon as novices by the rest of the unit until they manage to blast off a few chunks of themselves. To fire their weighty guns, Leadbelchers fill the barrel with shovel-like handfuls of crude black powder, metal shot, rusty nails, an assortment of wickedly bladed weaponry, and occasionally an actual cannonball or similar-sized boulder. The Leadbelchers go to battle with smoldering tapers pushed through the flesh of their scalps or held between their teeth. When a prospective target comes into range, they touch torch to the spark holes and loose thunderous blasts of hot metal and pure concussive force. If all goes well, these shots will blast apart the target or shred it with a salvo of chopping blades. Entire ranks have been blown to smithereens before the hellish firepower of the Leadbelchers, but if it goes poorly, a volley will merely inconvenience the foe, with hot wind, smoke, and pinging sounds as the small metal fragments fly out of the thick coils of smoke that momentarily hide the ogres. After discharging their guns, ogres will immediately move to reload, scooping yet more scraps of iron into the maws of their firearms. However, should the enemy close too quickly, Leadbelchers are not all averse to hefting up the iron barrels and using them as massive clubs to smite their enemies. It was this muscle-bound technique that the Leadbelchers of the Big Club tribe, a unit notorious for their poor aim, used to beat to death the giant mutated war beast that the Ratmen of Crookback Mountain unleashed upon them. Although the Leadbelchers maintained that most of the damage was done at range, everyone present was more impressed by their prodigious close-quarter prowess. Leadbelchers, I think, are going to be something that is very akin to the way the dwarfs have their dwarf thunderers and the such, right? These units that are simply dwarf warriors with ranged weapons. The ogres have Leadbelchers have the exact same stat line as ogres. Leadbelcher gun in and of itself is pretty terrifying. Playing against this in tabletop when you're playing as the High Elves, not too fun. So it's got multiple shots and it's got armor piercing. And it also has a special rule called slow to fire and a small range of 24 inches. So the way I kind of see this thing being envisioned is an anti-infantry AP basically shotgun, right? This thing should basically work in slow firing intervals, but when it does, it should level units. It should chunk out massive amounts of damage. Because remember, you're not going to have a huge amount of these things per unit. You're maybe going to be looking at 12 of these shooting down range. While that is a large amount, I would expect that if all 12 go off, and I think that's got to be a hidden thing built into the actual rules themselves, that not all 12 will fire at the same time. Maybe you'll get lucky and all 12 will actually go off, but maybe some will just kind of misfire and you'll get a big tuft of smoke instead. So I like to see this thing really do a lot of damage to units, but of course the caveat is that it has a small range and it has a slow to fire mechanic behind it. But this is our very first range unit, and you can see that it's a very characteristic range unit of the ogres. Plays into very much in their size and how they kind of approach warfare. So it's a very fun unit, very thematic. I can't wait to see this thing on the battlefield. Let's move over to another fun ogre unit though. The Ogre Maneaters. Ogre Maneaters are veterans of many campaigns fought in far-off lands. Traveling mercenaries beyond peer, they have spent decades accruing scars, tall tales, wealth, exotic gear, and new skills before heading back to the Ogre Kingdoms. Maneaters have fought throughout the old world and beyond, and many races attempt to recruit such fighters into their armies, promising food, gold, or whatever else the ogres want in return for their services. It is the pay that matters, not the foe. Although with some contracts, Maneaters are awarded fallen enemies to eat, so in those cases the enemy may matter. Ogres will eat anything, but they have preferences. Maneaters inherit the cultures of the lands they visit rather than spread their own. These mercenaries learn the fighting skills and adopt the style of dress appropriate to the lands in which they fight. For example, a Maneater in the Empire might wear breeches and ostentatious feather with a brace of huge pistols across his chest. A Maneater campaigning in the jungles of the Southlands might go into battle as the savage orcs do, that is, wearing an undersized loincloth, a gut plate, and nothing else but smeary war paint, although more civilized folk might not want to visualize that. Maneaters tend to operate in small groups, some of which have fought together for years. Despite their outlandish appearance, these tight-knit bands excel at breaking heads. At the Battle of Coffer's Gap, a small unit of Maneaters held out against invading barbarians for an entire week, allowing the Empire to muster an army and counterattack. When the Empire forces finally battled their way through to the Ogres, they found themselves surrounded by huge piles of the dead, with the body of the northern chieftain merrily roasting over this cooking fire. All they would say about the siege was that the Marauders were good eating, and wanted to know where they could find some more. It's rare for any two Maneaters to fight or be equipped in exactly the same manner, and opponents find themselves fighting against a dizzying array of different weapons and combat techniques. The only real factors uniting the individualistic Maneaters are their monumentally inflated sense of self-worth, and their capacity to smash aside lesser creatures without breaking a sweat. When they return to the Ogre Kingdoms, Maneaters take any opportunity to bore their tribesmates with long, fanciful war stories, some of which are even true. Although such tales are tiresome, an Ogre Tyrant is always happy if he can call on the services of 1 or 2 units of Maneaters to aid his tribe. They will be used to lead important attacks or hold a vital part of the battle line. Maneaters are famously stubborn opponents and usually prefer to fight to their last breath rather than flee. After all, they have learned the hard way that if they run off in the course of a battle, they won't get paid. We've talked about Maneaters a little bit with our legendary lord that is the Maneater. So with these guys, you get some pretty cool special rules. You get one that's called Been There, Done That. And the way this works is you select a special attribute that you want to give to the Maneaters. Immune to psychology, poisoned attacks, scouts, sniper, strider, stubborn, swift stride, or vanguard. The options you have available to you, because Maneaters themselves can have a wide variety of weapons. They can choose to have an additional hand weapon, they can choose to have great weapons, ogre pistols, or a brace of ogre pistols, a single ogre pistol or a brace of ogre pistols. So the way I would see these guys kind of being incorporated into Total War Warhammer is, rather than selecting a unit and customizing how they're built out, whatever one you select, either the dual-wielding Maneaters, which maybe they're anti-infantry with poisoned attacks, or if you choose the great weapons, maybe they're stubborn with, I don't know, vanguard deployment, or maybe that's even with the additional weapon, or the single ogre pistol with the hand weapon. Maybe that is the one that's got like maybe that's the one with the vanguard deployment. Or the one where they've got the brace of pistols, maybe they've got sniper. So I think the way that Creative Assembly is going to take these guys is that they're going to make them a unit that can specialize into a bunch of different formats of play. So they can be your dual-wielding pistols or dual-wielding weapons or great weapons for your anti-infantry. For your AP. So I think it's going to depend on that. Maybe they're just going to give all of them stubborn and poisoned attacks so that you have the viability and the difference between them all. Because the only difference between a Maneater and a non-Maneater, like a just normal ogre, is that they have a strength of 5, meaning that they would just have a higher weapon strength. I believe actually their ballistic skill, the weapon skill is 1 higher as well. So a Maneater is going to have a higher melee attack and a weapon strength than your standard ogre, and just maybe a different assortment of actual weapons. His armor would be the same. It would just simply be light armor. So that's how I think they would incorporate the Maneaters into them. So I think now we've talked about quite a few of the ogres in the ogre army list. Let's switch over to some beast units or some things that are just a little bit non-ogreish now, such as Sabretusk packs. Red in tooth and claw, an apt description for a Sabretusk, as this powerfully muscled hunting beast is a creature perfectly evolved for slaughter. A lone Sabretusk will bound into the midst of its prey, slashing and stabbing with its elongated tusks, seeking to sever arteries and disembowel its quarry. The snarling assault that follows is a fury of pounces, bites, and ripping claws. Should an entire pack of Sabretusks attack at once, then even the largest beasts that haunt the mountains of Mourn can be quickly brought down in a howling flurry, leaving a red mist hanging in the frosty air. Sabretusks are opportunistic hunters that prowl the slopes and valleys of the mountains of Mourn. They are silent stalkers, preferring to stealthily work towards unguarded flanks or rear positions before springing their attack. However, a hungry pack is more than bold enough for a straightforward clash, and ogres admit that even their most numerous hunting parties are not safe from the predations of Sabretusks. Although soundless while stalking its victim, upon slaying its mark, a Sabretusk will proclaim its kill to the pack with an enormous roar, a frightful sound that echoes off the peaks. Despite their savagery, Sabretusks are fickle like all felines, and are not above turning tail and bolting should their initial assault go against them. Ogres first encountered the Sabretusks during the big migration from the ruined plains. Although many stragglers were picked off and eaten by the predators, the ogres have found much to admire in the Sabretusk, and may have even learned how to take down large creatures by watching a pride work together to slay a beast many times their own size. It is said that the greatest of ogre hunters, Jared the Red, was the first to keep Sabretusks in order to help him sniff out and hunt cave beasts. In honor of Jared the Red, many hunters still tame their own Sabretusks. Large sets of claw scars are common sights among such hunters, for some beasts simply refused to be domesticated. Once broken into service, a hunter will send his Sabretusks to chase down vulnerable or wounded victims, or to soften up the foe ahead of his attack. So we did talk about how Sabretusks, hunters can join them. It's the only thing that hunters can join. But for the most part, I think Sabretusks are going to be very straightforward. It's just going to be your vanguard, fast attack beast unit, right? We see this in dire wolves, we see this in chaos warhounds and Norscan ice wolves, so many different variations. Maybe these guys are going to be, rather than the typical standard size of dire wolves and chaos warhounds and such, maybe they're a larger size unit, like a monstrous fast cav, I guess, of sorts, because you could kind of equate it that way. They could have a stock mechanic built into them in the same way that their lore description has, but if I take a look at their actual tabletop mechanics, they just cause fear. So these guys are going to be very straightforward, but I think they're nonetheless going to be a necessary component for Ogre Kingdoms, especially when they're fighting armies that are very range heavy, just as a means to disrupt that back line and get some tension in there so they can get the rest of their units to the battlefield. Let's move on to the Yeti. The Yeti packs inhabit the highest slopes of many mountain ranges, but are particularly common amongst the mountains of Mourn and the place of their birth, the towering peaks of the ancient giant holds. There, high on the roof of the world, the Yetis survive by preying on the beast herds of the highlands. The pale pelts of the Yetis make them hard to spot in the snowy landscape, and only when their saggy hair is overly matted and blood-speckled are they easy to pick out. There is a strange and almost supernatural connection between the Yetis and the high-altitude mountains themselves. Indeed, the Yetis exude an aura of cold so powerful that those attacked by them will find their limbs stiffened and joints frozen, making them easy prey for these fierce and feral predators. A large-scale attack by a whole pack of Yetis is inevitably heralded by an avalanche, which the creatures trigger deliberately in order to trap their prey before lopping down the side of the mountain to claw out and devour their half-frozen victims. Yetis have developed long, fused claws that are the natural equivalent of climbing pitons, with dew claws on the back hinge, allowing them to climb features other races could not negotiate. A blow from a Yeti's iron-hard claws will rip off limbs and heads with ease, and they are also ideal for quickly digging out half-frozen victims buried by snow and ice. Even with their deadly claws, a vestige of ogre-like behavior remains in the Yeti's ancestry to ensure that they still use clubs of sorts, fashioning ice weapons by the simple, expedient method of snapping a bow from a tree and breathing pure cold onto it until it resembles a massive ice-encrusted club. Dominant Yetis sometimes use pairs of these, smashing apart everything in their path. It is not uncommon for an ogre tribe to include some Yetis amongst its ranks. How or why the Yetis are convinced to fight alongside the ogres is a subject of much speculation. Some scholars suspect that Yetis are a remote offshoot of the ogre species, dating back to the Big Migration. Others theorize that the Yetis owe the ogres a great debt from somewhere in their distant past, even before they evolved into creatures of ice and snow, and hence their habitual reply to the ogre summons to war is one of ancestral honor rather than any kind of learned response. Whatever the truth of the matter, an ogre tyrant is able to summon Yetis to war by a blast on the Great Horn, a huge curling tusk taken from the largest ice mammoth killed by the tribe. The acoustic qualities of this horn, twinned with the mighty lungs of the ogre sounding it, send the blast echoing to the peaks of the mountain range. Riding great avalanches of snow, the Yetis will enter the Ogre Kingdoms, ready for the great hunt that is open war. Yetis that spend too much time in the lowlands, to them anything not above the tree line, become lethargic and will begin to wither beneath a hot sun. For these reasons, once their obligation to the ogres is complete, Yetis will return to the mountain lairs. Yetis are powerful and can sprint as fast as an armored horse. Because of this, they are usually used by an ogre tyrant in much the same way the cavalry are used in other armies, to deliver swift attacks on weak points in the enemy line, and to help pursue a defeated opponent from the battlefield. With their sheer brute strength and ferocious nature, Yetis can smash a hole in an enemy battle line or maul any opponent that dares to stand up to them. Yetis are pretty interesting. The lore describes them as very quick and very much like cavalry, but their move characteristic, not so much so. It's not that much that much faster than most other units of the same size. Its move is 7, so it's not very, very, very fast. It's not like it's going to bound 12 inches like some flying beast of war, but it is still pretty quick. So that leads me to wonder how these things are going to be incorporated in Total War. Will they have a speed lower than Sabretusks, but much higher than the majority of the army? Could make a lot of sense. Move them to 7. Okay, cool. I could see that. I mean, when I look at some other things like the Mournfang, which we'll get to in a bit, their movement is 8. So they're the actual true cav of the Ogre Kingdoms. These guys, I guess, are a little bit slower because they are, after all, on legs. So maybe these things are kind of akin to skin wolves, almost said werewolves. Skin wolves in the sense that they're a little bit quicker on their feet. They wouldn't be able to catch up to maybe a conventional cavalry, but at the same time, they'll be able to kind of sweep into them and do quite a bit of damage. As far as special rules go, is they have Fear, Flammable, which is interesting, Swift Strive, so they'll be able to move around without being hindered from any kind of dangerous terrain, and they have Aura of Frost. So I see these things having the exact same characteristic as a Frost Drake. Their Aura of Frost, which is going to slow things down around them, and a Frostbite ability, because the way this describes here is Yetis have evolved a specific affinity with the sub-zero temperatures of their mountainside homes. The magical aura of cold that they exhale not only freezes the blood and marrow of their victims, but also wreathes the crude weapons wielded by the Yetis with enchanted ice. So I see that Frostbite effect applying to the Yetis quite heavily. Now, I kind of thought of them maybe having the stock mechanic because of the way they blend into snow, but it's just they're talking about the snow. And I think that when we talk about the Gorger, which we will, or the Gorgers, which we will in just a little bit, that'll play a little bit more into them. But this is one of our first real big kind of scary monstrous beasts that we see in the Ogre Kingdoms, and they're pretty gnarly. Like, to see Yetis as a whole is going to be pretty awesome on the battlefield. To see them kind of wreathed in in ice and kind of have like the frosty glow coming off of them with, like, basically, I guess you could say, the you're out in cold air and you're blowing out CO2. My brain's shit right now, but still, my point remains, though, to see these on the battlefield is going to be quite cool, I think, once we get to Total War Warhammer 3. But let's go into the Gorgers now, which have quite the big chunk of lore, so hang tight for this one. When a scrawny ogre is born, the tribe does not suffer the weakling to live. Those born with gangly limbs or without an ogre's signature paunch are given over to a butcher who takes them to the deepest cave near the campsite. This cave mouth is invariably sealed with a boulder of tremendous size, but when this heftily blocking device is rolled aside, the mewling newborn is then tossed into the gaping pit and the boulder heaved back into place once again. In ogre society, weakness is a death warrant, and by offering a sacrifice to the Great Maw, the tribe shows that it is strong. Ever since the ogres migrated from the plains, stunted births have become common, and many offerings are cast into the darkness. The caves of the Mountains of Mourn are home to many monstrosities, and it would take extreme good luck for a full-grown ogre to survive for a week. Yet somehow, despite the dangers and the great odds against it, some of the undersized ogre whelplings live, such as their hopeless vitality to cling to life. The few forsaken that survive their first few days begin to scrape out an existence in the darkness, scrabbling for sustenance and feeding on the base things that crawl in the dampness. Rats, fang leeches, crust worms, and any scraps of carcass thrown into the interconnecting tunnels by other ogres. Using stealth and savagery born of rock-bottom desperation, a small handful of the aberrant infants eke out an unwholesome and troglodytic existence. The tunnels below the Mountains of Mourn hold more secrets than just unwanted ogre cast-offs. Unbeknownst to any save a few clans of ratmen, the undertunnels are laced with warpstone, the strange black or green glowing rock that contaminates all it touches. Those ogre spawn that live long enough learn to survive by snaking their emaciated frames into narrow crevices to avoid predators, which, naturally, include other gorgers, who think nothing about acts of cannibalism. The beasts are so hungry that they will gobble up anything they can scrounge, even the most tainted of things. This unnatural diet speeds their own mutations until the sinewy, filth-encrusted creatures twist and grow into something horrible, what ogres know as a gorger. Even more ravenous than an ogre, gorgers are degenerate eating machines consisting of nothing but taut muscle, claws, and ferocity. To aid a gorger in its all-consuming quest to feed, he can distend his jaw in the same way as many serpents do in order to swallow larger prey. If that weren't enough, their mouths are crammed full of teeth that grow rapidly to push through their slimy gums, replacing themselves daily or sometimes even more quickly. Accustomed to the pitch black of the underground, gorgers use their flared nostrils to sniff out prey, which they will stalk relentlessly. Sometimes gorgers unwittingly happen upon an entrance to other caves, perhaps skaven tunnels or the workings of a dwarf mine. The gorger will drag itself through the smallest of openings in order to run amok in such a food-rich environment. They will assail all that they can find, and the wet, snapping sounds of broken remnants being devoured will echo down the hallways. Some gorgers occasionally escape the underground labyrinths, scampering out when their pits are unblocked or finding new exits that lead outward. There, in the dark, they will stalk the valleys of the Mountains of Mourn, sniffing out and devouring the unwary, returning to their caves before daybreak. When ogres go to war, tyrants unblock the tunnels and lure out gorgers with carcasses. Gorgers are either captured and dragged to the battle in cages, or led in the right direction by a trail of blood-soaked flesh. Ogres often blindfold captured gorgers before unleashing them, as the creature's beady eyes are so unaccustomed to light they howl when exposed to the sun. Gorgers are so used to hunting in the dark that this blindness does not hamper their fighting abilities, as they scent the blood of the foe on the wind. With a profusion of razor-sharp teeth and scything claws, a gorger attacks with a savage ferocity that frequently lops off heads and limbs, splattering gore and viscera in wide arcs. To say that the gorger is not Gollum as an ogre would just be completely wrong, my precious. And they're quite good at what they do. And they're ambushers. They've got fear, they've got frenzy, they've got killing blow, they're unbreakable. They're pretty terrifying. Murderers. So I picture these guys to be exactly what they are. I guess an easy equivalent would be like, picture a Vargulf with, well, I guess you couldn't put stock because stock isn't built into this character. Ambush worked differently than Vanguard deployment. Vanguard deployment you would do at the end of everyone's deployment phase, but before the game starts. Ambusher works at turns 2 and turns 3. If you roll a 2 up on turn 2, you can deploy. Roll 3 up on turn 3, so on and so forth. If you don't end up deploying the unit, then he dies and your opponent gets the victory points for it. That's how ambushers worked in tabletop. So I'm not sure if this means that this unit would actually have Vanguard deployment and stock because of the way Vanguard works in Total War Warhammer. I mean, you can't really have this unit come onto the battlefield at a random moment. Maybe you have an ambusher ability where you can actually use it almost like an activatable summon, that he can come out of the battlefield within a certain radius of things. That's the way ambusher worked. I think it was like you couldn't deploy within 1 inch of someone or something along those lines. But he causes fear just as other ogres do. He's got frenzy, which would be amazing. Killing blow would be an anti-infantry and AP characteristic like we've seen put onto stuff like the Grave Guard. And then unbreakable on top of that. So this thing would be pretty terrifying at ravaging through a back line. If Yetis can be more equivalent to Mourn Gulls, then you could say that the Gorger would be more equivalent to a Mourn Ghast, if you want to just kind of make that, again, equivalency. But I think they're a really fun and really crazy unit, because again, it's Gollum as an ogre, you know? He's harmless, completely harmless. But let's keep moving on down this special list. With our very last special unit, the Mournfang Cavalry. High up the slopes of the Mountains of Mourn lives a cave-dwelling beast that has always attracted the attention of the ogres, Mournfang. Aggressive predators that stalk the icy slopes, Mournfang packs are led by the largest of their kind, and, working together, they can hunt and kill anything that lives in that harsh domain. Mournfangs have a notorious tenacity that makes even the most powerful of creatures think twice about confronting them. Ogre's tales tell of defiant Mournfangs blocking cave entrances or refusing to give ground, and every tribe has a story about a beast continuing to fight long after drawing its last breath. It is this bold resilience that attracts ogres to Mournfangs, for it is hard not to respect an animal that will continue to bite and slash even when its brain has ceased to function. Ogres have tried to capture and break the beasts for mounts since they first encountered the Mournfang, although for centuries every attempt ended in death or crippling injuries for the ogres. Over the years it has become a sort of rite of ogrehood as young aspirants head up the mountains in their attempts to capture one of the savage beasts. It was Ogre Rollgut Hamfist's discovery of the leadership challenges amongst Mournfang packs that led to the first successful capture. In battles reminiscent of Tyrant challenges in the Maw Pit, the largest Mournfangs engage in their own violent fights to claim the pack's alpha position. Their bloody and protracted contests result in the death of the losing beast, as even these bad-tempered hulks of muscle and matted hair can bleed to death. The victor will be exhausted and have lost a lot of blood as a result of the fight. As Rollgut discovered, this is the best time for an ogre to vault into a Mournfang's back. If the ogre can hold on during the wild ride that follows and can remain atop the beast until it passes out from blood loss and exertion, he will have done it. For when the groggy Mournfang finally comes to, it will concede to its new master. Ogres that fall off during this violent rodeo are gored and eaten by their quarry. For the successful aspirants, there follows a period in which the would-be Mournfang rider must remain strong in the saddle at all times, steering the beast with his club. The Mournfang, its walnut-sized brain addled by the repeated blows, finally becomes fully accustomed to bearing a rider. Once a Mournfang has been broken in this manner, it is nearly possible to domesticate it, and the great beast will live and travel with the ogre tribe. Mournfangs in such captivity do not breed, however, so ogres must still climb the mountains to seek out Mournfang packs in the midst of their own leadership challenges. There is a fortune to be made as a mercenary for a young ogre with his own Mournfang, and every spring a few stout lads from the upper slopes will join together and sell their services as the heaviest shock cav in the known world. Powered by thick haunches of purest muscle, Mournfangs surge forward the foe at a speed faster than their muscle-bulked frames would suggest, not slowed in the least by the large ogre or saddled atop its hairy back. Protected by thick skin and coarse, shaggy hair, enemy arrows bounce off the oncoming beasts or ping off the ogre's armor as harmless as hailstones. When they do smash into an enemy, the powerful Mournfangs chop, slash, and stamp the foe, whilst the ogres lay about them, swinging ponderous clubs to bludgeon the foe. The results are devastating, with the fallen not just slain but utterly pulverized, pounded into the ground by a profusion of heavy blows. Although whole units of Mournfang cavalry can usually secure the victory of any battle they are engaged in, these brutes and their gigantic steeds do not come cheap. The tyrants or paymasters of the victorious side often note a profound feeling of loss when the spoils of war are shared out. This marks the very first monstrous cav unit, or the first cavalry unit, for the Ogre Kingdom. And they do a terrifying amount of damage. They've got impact hits, which are very similar to Ogre Charge, only they have a higher strength value, and they do D3 in tabletop, or D3 damage, or D3 amounts of hits. So what that really means is that these guys are going to be very devastating on the charge when it comes to Total War Warhammer 3. And if you take a look at let's just say that the 4 races that they'll add in the beginning, this is purely speculation, is Kislev, Chaos Dwarfs, Ogre Kingdoms, and Demons. Well, okay, Kislev gets Bear Cav, that's going to be pretty devastating on the charge. Mournfang Cav for the Ogre Kingdoms, then you've got the Juggernauts of Khorne for the Demons of Chaos, and then the Bull Centaurs for the Chaos Dwarfs. So you really have a lot of devastatingly scary, monstrous cav coming in Total War Warhammer 3. And if you think about it by comparison to Total War Warhammer 2, you really just have what? Like the Altdorf Griffites and a number of other a number of other monstrous cav units, but not a ton for every single race. So I think the Mournfang cav are going to be pretty terrifying when it comes to the battlefield. I mean, they already have an ogre on top of them. They're going to have that same profile that ogres do with the 3 wounds and 3 attacks, so expect a lot of health, not a lot of units in the actual unit itself, maybe 12, I'd say. And these guys have it talks a little bit in the lore about how, you know, it takes the thick skin of the Mournfang itself can take a lot of shots. Well, that is an actual representation as a rule. A rider atop a Mournfang receives an armor save bonus of 2-up rather than the usual 1-up for cavalry mounts. Meaning that if you were to take the Mournfang cavalry with a great weapon rather than an Iron Fist, because remember how we talked about Iron Fist is the equivalent of an Ogre Kingdom shield? Well, you would still get a 2-up save on the mount, which is pretty damn awesome when it came to tabletop. So, I would see the Mournfang Cav of one of the typical kind of split that we see with cavalry. I would see them having a perpetual combat unit in that it would have a sword and Iron Fist or shield, quote unquote, and then another one that has great weapons. So basically one that has a high AP value that can really put a lot of hurt into things that are the other monstrous cav that you're probably going to be charging into. These guys do have heavy armor, so these guys are really, I think, going to be a very high cost, probably a 1400, 1500 point cav unit that is going to do a lot of damage on the charge. I would expect, again, something that really amplifies that charge bonus as a result of being impact hits or Ogre Kingdom, Ogre Charge, whatever you want to call it, in addition to also having some thick skin. And I don't know if that means that we'll be seeing missile resistance on the great weapon variant just because of as a nod to that thick skin. I'm not overly sure, but I definitely think that when these things come to the battlefield in Total War Warhammer 3, they're going to be pretty disgusting. As you can see from the art and from the actual models, they're one of the coolest looking things in the Ogre Kingdom army list. I think they're awesome, and they're still in it today in the Age of Sigmar version. So let's jump on over to the rare choices and start to square things off here. The first one on this list of rare units is going to be a pretty familiar one, the Giant. So we'll do the Giant's lore blurb, but we're not really going to talk about anything special regarding him. It's just going to be the same exact Giant that we've seen pretty much carbon copied across the Greenskins, the Beastmen, Norskins, so on and so forth. Giants are enormous lumbering brutes that stride the world seeking battle, food, and strong liquors. They are humanoid in appearance, although their features are coarse and misshapen. They are dull-witted even when compared to an average ogre, which is really saying something. An ogre tyrant, if he can restrain himself from attacking the giant to prove his own superiority, will often try to recruit the solitary wanderers into his tribe. Sharing food or intoxicating drink with the enormous lummox often does the trick, as do promises of an easy life full of eating and drinking. All that is required of the giant is that he helps the tribe in battle. More brazen tyrants might actually intimidate a giant into joining the tribe, either by displaying his own fierce fighting prowess to physically best the brute, or by scaring the behemoth with exaggerated tales of his tribe's past experiences eating sky titans. Giants that do join an ogre tribe are often branded with the tribe symbol. This is done partially to instill some tribal pride in the non-ogre, but perhaps more so to remind his own tribe mates that he is a friend and not a foe. In the heat of battle, such things often escape an ogre's attention, and there is a natural compulsion to fight and eat a giant. After all, it is every ogre's dream to boast of felling a big one. So, again, nothing really special about these guys. I just really wanted to talk about the lore from them, just so that you had what their lore was like from the Ogre Kingdom perspective. Let's jump on over to the next one. And it'll be our first actual siege engine of sorts in the Gnoblar Scrap Launchers. The Gnoblar Scrap Launcher is an impressive war machine. It is a large and unconventionally built catapult pulled along by an enormous woolly beast. Its design is haphazard, the ramshackle construction seemingly built on the go with a random collection of cast-off materials. With each stride of its shaggy beast of burden, the jury-rigged device teeters precariously while a frenetic crew of Gnoblars swarm about, running alongside, clambering on its ropes and pulleys like sailors amongst the rigging, or just hanging on for dear life. For all its slovenly appearance, the Gnoblar Scrap Launcher is a devastating engine of destruction. Too slight or lazy to lift rocks, the Gnoblars pack the launcher cup with bundles of weapons that have been accrued during battles. As the so-called thinling weapons are too tiny for ogres and too large for Gnoblars, they are used as ammunition. These loose-knit bundles of nastiness are hurled towards an enemy like a deadly rain. While the deluge of sharp instruments may sometimes only pincushion the ground or clang loudly against a foe, so many lethal sharp bits fly through the air that odds are at least a few will strike tender flesh. After a battle, it is a simple matter to gather the weapons back during the pre-feast corpse harvest. Many of the blades have seen more battles than the Gnoblars who fire them. The beast that tows the scrap launcher is usually a young Rhinox. Adult Rhinoxen are simply too big and stubborn to haul anything, but the younger ones are not yet so strong-willed. Other creatures have been tried, from the Mournfang to the Thundertusk and even a Stonehorn, but the results were unfavorable at best, with lots of smashed timber and squished out Gnoblar-shaped blotches left behind. A Rhinox, even a young one, is a massive creature that hardly strains to pull whatever the Gnoblars build, including great sledges topped with loading platforms, winches, and even vast support beams braced on the beast itself. Unlike most other war machines, the scrap launcher moves at a steady clip, and it is just as deadly smashing into enemy units as it is at shooting, the Rhinox being only too willing to put down its head and charge. So the scrap launchers, and for that matter the Ogre Kingdom artillery, is very unique. We talked about this a little bit when we went over the Kislev artillery pieces, and how it would probably be something along the lines of horse-drawn artillery. Well, the Gnoblar scrap launcher is a walking artillery piece, very akin to the Lizardmen and their vivification crystals and how that's a support platform, the Sun Crystal and how that's shooting down range at things while still moving. I see the same kind of thing happening for the Gnoblar scrap launchers. The scrap launcher itself in the tabletop is designated a stone thrower. The scrap launcher catapult is a stone thrower with the profile and special rules shown below. So, I think it fits to be that same profile as something lobbing things, right? Like a stone thrower would. But I would look at this as more of like an anti-infantry AP type platform, versus the next one we're going to talk about, the Ironblaster, as more of the AP anti-large platform. So maybe in the tabletop it has a 12 to 48 inch range because it has a number of misfire situations that can go on. We've already seen with the Skaven how Creative Assembly doesn't really play well with those misfire tables or with that sense of randomness. So I would see this thing with a pretty medium to short range, but actually have a lot of capabilities in combat. It itself would be pretty devastating, not on a charge. Like, I wouldn't put this thing on as an aggressive piece of artillery, but if you were to say charge it, I think it would really hold up in battle a lot longer. Just the same thing as a Bastiladon does. When it gets charged, it has to be charged with the right things to really put it to rout. So I think that's going to be the cool thing about the Gnoblar scrap launchers and the Ironblaster, which we're about to talk about next, is how they're going to change the way artillery pieces work in Total War Warhammer 3. I think as a whole, with the way that the Chaos Dwarfs have their artillery pieces and how there's going to be so many of them, I think we'll see the more standard style of artillery. But Kislev, I could see horse-drawn artillery. With the Ogre Kingdoms, you clearly have these beast-drawn artilleries, and they were pretty terrifying in tabletop. I remember my High Elves just got completely decimated by scrap launchers just because they have Killing Blow on them. They can do quite a bit of damage. So I'm very curious to see how Creative Assembly incorporates these into Total War Warhammer 3 without really breaking the bank as far as their mechanics. I mean, you can't have these things be too ridiculous here. Maybe the Rhinox has a rampage mechanic built into it. Who really knows? But let's move on over to the other artillery piece for the Ogre Kingdoms. Now, the Ironblaster, again, has quite a grip of lore. To be totally honest with you, the next three things, the last three things we're going to cover, have almost a page to a page and a half of lore, but I'm not going to cheat you guys of the lore here, so let's dive on in. The origins of the Ironblaster are comparatively recent and make for popular tales around the campfires of the Ogre Kingdom. The Iron-Skinned tribe, famous for their love of metal and the sheer number of cannon-toting madmen in their ranks, held a contest to see who could unleash the most destruction during the Great Gnoblar Purge of 2211. Amongst their number was Borgot Sevenbellies, an ogre possessed of much physical strength as well as sheer girth and an eye for an opportunity. He left the contest with a wild gleam in his eye and began the long climb into the mountains, eventually reaching the tumble-down ruins that were once the majestic castles of the Sky Titans. Borgot remembered seeing something when a few decades back, when he had a mere 3 bellies to his name, he had prowled the debris as a youth. Searching through the rubble, Borgot unearthed a massive bronze cylinder covered in an elaborate frisee that depicted the war in the heavens, like unto a Leadbelcher gun or one of the Thinling's cannons, but far larger. This was one of the castle-mounted guns the Sky Titans used towards the end of their war against the ogres all those years ago, and Borgot believed it was a high time such weapons were put back into use. Taming a nearby Rhinox with repeated blows of his club, Bogrot strapped the immense cannon to his new pet and sent it down the mountainside, that astride the enormous bronze cylinder, content to let gravity do most of the work. Rather more quickly than he anticipated, Bogrot returned to his tribe covered in glory and bruises, the bronze cannon intact. It did not take long for the tribe to catch on to what Bogrot had in mind. The tribe pooled all of its remaining black powder and, priming the great cannon, loaded cannonball after cannonball into its cavernous maw until it was full to the brim. The enormous gun, which by now had been mounted on a ramshackle chassis and properly secured to the captive Rhinox, was taken to the main entrance of the Gnoblar tunnel town and wedged into the passageway's mouth. Bogrot was given the honor of setting light to the fuse. Within one blinding, deafening second, the Gnoblar infestation was no more. The shower of green limbs that erupted from dozens of hidden bolt holes provided much amusement and formed a deliciously smoky appetizer for the Ironskin tribe before they headed back for a proper celebration. Pleased to get rid of the Gnoblars, even if it was only for a little while before new ones crept in, the Tyrant allowed Bogrot to sit beside him during the feast. Since that famous day, many ogres from Ironskin tribe have climbed high into the mountains of the ancient giant lands in order to secure more of the Sky Titan's old artillery. It didn't take long for the Ironblaster to be seen and coveted by the other tyrants of the Ogre kingdoms. Now many tribes can boast of several Ironblasters, the great weapon wagons usually being crewed by the largest and richest Leadbelchers in each tribe. The cobbled together wagon that is used to mount the enormous gun barrel is also used to haul the vast quantities of gunpowder needed. Such is the weight of the vast contraption that Rhinoxes which pull it grunt and strain under the pressure, and even the stone wheels that hold it up can only last for a few battles before cracking under the immense weight. Ogres use few things that require maintenance. However, the destructive force of an Ironblaster has persuaded many tyrants to order a search for extra wheels or support horns when the device breaks down, as it is prone to do on the many nomadic moves of a tribe. Between battles, it requires a virtual army of Gnoblars to maintain the war machine. In its carriage, the little runts of 10 needing to patch the rotting planks together or use gut rope to bind the vast horns back into place so that the cannon can once again swivel. When deployed in battle, the Ironblaster is hauled into a good shooting position before blasting out a fiery tongue of flame and a thunderous boom. The multiple cannonballs are able to tear apart a whole regiment in a maelstrom of noise and violence, especially should the Ironblaster get in close. The advantage of getting close is that, with the right encouragement of a few stiff prods, the Rhinox can strain enough to really get the Ironblaster wagon moving quickly. Something that large with so much momentum can really pack a wallop when it hits. If the sheer impact doesn't smash the foe, perhaps the Ogre's blows or the gouging horns of the Rhinox can finish the job. When things go wrong for an Ironblaster, however, they really go very badly wrong indeed. It can be safely said that ogres do not make the canniest of artillerymen, overloading, underloading, touching flame to the spark hole too soon, or just plain joyriding, too enthralled with the opportunity to ride in a pulled wagon firing the largest cannon imaginable. Still, the giant cannons were forged to last, so even after the most horrific of accidents, it is never long before a new chassis is constructed, a new Leadbelcher found to crew the mighty gun, the cycle of violence done anew. So these things are pretty damn terrifying. It almost sounds like Big Bess on a chariot. Even from the lore, it talks about how these things are willingly slammed into the enemy, and maybe that's the way that they're going to be used in Total War Warhammer 3, contrary to how I really spoke about things with the Gnoblar Scrap Launcher. Maybe the Gnoblar Scrap Launcher to me doesn't seem like as destructive of a beast artillery piece of war like the Ironblaster does, but that might be kind of the crux of the Ogre Kingdom is, yeah, sure, they do have access to some pretty devastating artillery pieces, but they are also really great as chariots. They have a pretty substantial move, just like most things do that have a Rhinox pulling them, and they can move and fire. So I think that the cannon of the Sky Titans will be a lot of fun in this game. The cannon of the Sky Titans, despite being crudely pressed into service by the Ogres, is actually a very robust and sophisticated example of its kind. It can fire whole clutches of cannonballs at once, allowing it to do a tremendous amount of damage, although the range of such attacks is limited. So it does have a 36-inch range, which is slightly lower than the Gnoblar Scrap Launcher at its peak, but it has a strength of 10 and it does multiple wounds d6. So I expect this thing, again, to be like a Queen Bess on a chariot, doing a lot of damage, choosing between either a volley of cannonballs or a massive grape shot. So I guess you could say very similar to the way that you have a select fire mode with all of the bolt throwers of the elves. I would see this being the same way. Doing a volley of cannonballs, AP anti-large damage. Doing a massive grape shot, AP anti-infantry damage. So I think that that's what makes this thing kind of cool, right? You have this Bastiladon that is effectively a Bastiladon, that is actually a Rhinox with an Ogre that can charge through things, slam through them, but at the same time shoot a mass amount of grape shot right before the charge, or shoot a volley of cannonballs before it knocks into a monstrous infantry unit like a Rotting Leviathan, or even a tank for the Empire. So I think the Ironblaster's application for the Ogre Kingdom is going to be quite vast, and I would expect this thing to be pretty expensive too, like 2100, 2400 points. Like I expect you to really put a lot of resources into fielding this in Total War Warhammer 3. If I'm talking from a multiplayer perspective, but at the same time, even from a campaign perspective, I would expect this to have a pretty decent upkeep. As you hear that this thing is the only thing really that ogres are willing to put upkeep into, and at the same time having like a 3 or 4 turn time to produce this bad boy. As a whole, I think it'll be a lot of fun once we see it onto the actual the game itself. Let's move over to 2 of the beast units now for the rare choices, starting with the only mount for the heroes and characters that the Ogre Kingdoms have access to. The mighty Stonehorn. Stonehorns are massive beasts of muscle and violence, each several times the size of a Rhinox, and, if it can be believed, several times as dense. Intelligence is of little import to these great beasts, however, for each Stonehorn is quite literally a living fossil, its skeleton hardened by the same rock as the mountains where it makes its home. As legendary as their hardiness is their belligerence. In fact, it is said that a Stonehorn will take any opportunity to headbutt something to death and trample its corpse into paste. Such is its colossal mass that the impact of its charge is like a boulder plummeting from a mountaintop, a deadly combination of weight, momentum, and a bad temper. A Stonehorn in a destructive rage is the kind of sight that causes ogres to gape in slack-jawed wonderment, for it is a display of raw, unthinking strength. It is common in ogre camps to hear the odd tales of Stonehorns shattering cliffsides or battering down mountain peaks, and these are not exaggerations, but everyday occurrences. Stonehorns live by mining rock, breaking off suitable chunks by smashing their impressively horned heads into the largest rock facings they can find. Deposits of precious stone and seams of rare metal are favored, but the creature will also use its iron-hard molars to crunch up mundane rubble or any mammals caught out of their dens. Yet as impressive as such feats are, they pale before the sight of a Stonehorn in combat. Intolerant to an extreme, a Stonehorn's first inclination is to charge any creature that comes within view. This is not mere bluff or half-hearted measure to scare off any who dare near, but instead a full tilt attempt to use its horns and bulk to pulverize anything in its way. Few can bear the brunt of such a collision. The Stonehorn can smash mountains asunder, so what hope does a creature of flesh and blood have to stand before such a beast? A Stonehorn's ferocity is not bound only by its charge. After impact, the great beast will rear up on its thick haunches to deliver crushing blows with its forelimbs, hammer blows that can crack a glacier or smash stone to powder. With growling fury, a Stonehorn will swing its horns in sweeping arcs, seeking to slice foes with the surprisingly sharp ridges that form on its stone prongs. Naturally, ogres have the greatest respect for Stonehorns, for the mammoth creatures are everything an ogre aspires to be: big, violent, strong, and rock hard. They never tire of telling and retelling their favorite accounts of a Stonehorn's prowess, or of the gory aftermath they leave after one of their stone-cracking charges. Whether it is the wide trails of dwarfs flattened and squished out of their armor, the wet crunching sounds a Stonehorn makes when plowing through Skaven hordes, or fond remembrances of giants pile-driven deep into the ground, such blood-drenched tales are greedily called for and laughed about at any raucous ogre feast. In their constant quest to headbutt things, Stonehorns often scrape skin, tendon, and meat from their faces, leaving bare patches or glimpses of skull-like stone masks. Over their long lives, Stonehorns become more like the mountains upon which they gaze, in a slow process of petrification. That's not the only effect of the Stonehorn's unnatural diet, where their bodies are dotted with mineral deposits the way freckles appear on humans, and the skull of an elder beast can house enough gems to make a merchant prince weep. Getting hold of those riches is difficult. Only a fool comes within sniffing distance of a live Stonehorn, and those that die of natural causes are secretive, plodding off to hidden valleys before fully transforming to stone. Those that stumble across such hidden grounds are struck by the eeriness of the silent statues. An ogre hunter who has tamed a Stonehorn is a celebrated individual. Stonehorns are oblivious to the most grievous wounds, and the only proven way to break one is to take one of its eyes, which is no mean feat given the beast's stone-armored skull. To achieve this, a hunter must stand in the path of a Stonehorn charge, and, as the ground shakes, stick a spear or land a harpoon in its eye. Those who miss seldom live to tell the tale, but those lucky enough to make the shot will be confronted with a rare sight indeed. That of a Stonehorn halting mid-charge as it registers pain for perhaps the first time in its long life. The hunter can then lead the Stonehorn back to its cave by yanking upon the embedded shaft. After a time, the wound heals, often the eyes even grow back, but by then the Stonehorn has been persuaded to allow a rider. A hunter might keep such a beast as his own mount, or if he wishes to boost his reputation, he could give the beast to a tribe, for Stonehorns are much coveted by all right-thinking ogres. So these things are absolutely insane. I mean, they've got the special rule of frenzy, and they cause terror, which you would just as well expect. They're the only things that ogres can ride, or that they do ride, in the entire army book, aside from the Mournfang. In addition, they have an earth-shattering charge, meaning it's a normal impact charge with 3 D3 hits. So it can just do a crap ton of damage on the charge. And it's got a natural armor, it's got a stone skeleton, which actually negates multiple wounds in the tabletop. So if I'm pushing this into Total War Warhammer 3, how would I do it? And there aren't really... I think that this guy is going to call for so many kind of unique mechanics to it that it's going to be kind of terrifying to see on the battlefield. It talks about how it can't really be controlled. So I would look at the Stonehorn as a non-mount. If you're just choosing the Stonehorn itself, I would see it being like subject to rampage almost immediately. Like maybe, okay, you can control it, put it into battle, but as soon as it hits battle, it's going to rampage and go wherever it wants. And that doesn't really matter to you because it's just going to be doing tons of damage, because on top of its charges, its terror, its frenzy, its massive size, like this thing I expect to just be so terrifying on the battlefield that, like, okay, I see one on the opposite end, I have to put that thing down as fast as possible. Maybe its stone skeleton has got the same kind of mechanic as, say, like a rotting leviathan or a bone giant, where it can reflect cannonballs that are shot at it. But maybe also it means that anything that has an anti-large characteristic is slightly reduced. Like it has like not an anti-large resistance, but let's say you have a cannonball that shoots 100 anti-large damage. Well, maybe its stone skeleton negates a portion of that just by the grace of it being so durable. So maybe if a hunter is controlling it, then you do have control of this thing as it moves through the battle. Maybe making hunters on Stonehorns a very kind of auto pick when it comes to choosing Stonehorns in your army. Like, well, I don't want this thing to kind of go all over the place. I'll choose a hunter alongside of it. In the tabletop, the mount and the rider, the mount itself, the Stonehorn and the rider had separate profiles, meaning that if one died, then the other would still be intact. And that was very true for a lot of things in tabletop, but they make it really out to be very evident in this case, because I think that the Ogre Kingdom book is trying to explain how, okay, these beasts are very independent on their own. They don't really need a rider, so if the rider dies, they don't really care. Most of the time, if the rider died in tabletop, the beast would be subject to frenzy and you'd lose control of it. So I think in this case, they're trying to make the claim that, yeah, well, these guys don't really need a rider. But that's not something that's ever been put into Total War Warhammer, so I don't really worry about that mechanic. But I think seeing these things in the game is going to be really fucking terrifying. Or just at least an amazing feat to just watch them slam through things. Like, watching the Necrosphinx attack is pretty awesome in its own right, but these things are supposed to be bigger than Necrosphinxes. So, not substantially bigger, but still bigger nonetheless, and their charge is way different too. It's a very, like, okay, they're going to charge in, then they're going to rear up and smash down. Like, I expect a lot of attack animations coming out of this thing, and I expect it to be very hard to stop in combat. I would imagine that Kind of like the Tomb Scorpion can kind of rip through things with its attack animation, I expect the same thing to kind of come out of a Stonehorn, it jumping through and lopping through combat and making it very hard to pin down. And again, I would expect this to be an extremely high cost unit, like 3,000 points, anti-infantry, AP, maybe even have it have anti-large as well, because it's just a massive creature and it's used to bucking things like mountains and also just stampeding over stuff. So I expect this thing to really be very devastating on the battlefield. And I think it's going to have to, like I said, have to have a lot of unique mechanics built into it. Let's move into the very last unit in our Ogre Kingdom list, and subsequently our very, very absolute last unit in the rare section, the Thundertusk. And interestingly enough, the Thundertusk and the Stonehorn shared a dual kit, meaning that when you purchased one box of one or the other, you could make either one of them, just depending on how you wanted to fit it out. This is the lore for the Thundertusks. Thundertusks are creatures of ice and doom, ancient monsters that strode the darkest ages long ago, when the world was frozen over. Retreating from the sudden warming of the sun, the forefathers of these mammoth beasts headed to the northern plains. They became saturated in the magic that was unleashed in those strange lands. Imbued by those unnatural winds, the Thundertusks became living embodiments of cruel and ever-enduring winter, primordial things from a long-forgotten past. Their hulking mass exudes an aura, a sub-zero blast of Arctic air so cold it congeals blood and freezes their prey. Thundertusks advance as relentlessly as a winter storm, using their numbing airs to slow their victims down, allowing the beasts to bring their cumbersome but crushing mass to bear. Thundertusks are solitary wanderers that travel across the cold places of the world, far to the north or high amidst the frozen peaks of the mountains. Needing a great deal of sustenance to sustain their bulk and icy nimbus, they are constantly roaming in search of fresh meat. But the Thundertusk is not just deadly up close, where it can stomp its frozen foes flat. A Thundertusk's horns attract the elemental power of magic, like a lightning conductor. The beast's icy breath mixes with this sorcerous flux, coalescing into swirling spheres of eldritch energy and jagged shards of ice. With a sound akin to the peal of a thunderclap, the Thundertusk can hurl these frozen orbs across the battlefield. Upon impact, the glowing sphere of frost shatters, sending lightning-wreathing icicles spinning through the air. The shards scythe into any exposed flesh, cutting bloody holes into anything within a wide radius. Because of its unnatural penchant for frost, Thundertusks become extremely irritable and uncomfortable in direct sunshine. Shedding patches of skin and cultivating coats of icicles upon their pelt can only compensate so much, and so the Thundertusk has developed a unique mechanism for surviving the heat during the relentless fairer seasons when the temperatures rise slightly above freezing. During any prolonged warm spell, a Thundertusk will hibernate within its chosen glacier, hacking and scooping out a crude cave with its gigantic blade-edged tusks until it can retreat from the punishing rays of the sun. There, in a cocoon of ice, the beast will slow its heartbeat and lower its body temperature further still, allowing the Thundertusk's freezing breath to slowly crystallize the moisture until the beast is completely surrounded in cooling ice. Safe from the predation of the beasts and ogre tribes of the mountains, the Thundertusk sleeps through the summer in its frozen refuge, healing the damage it sustained during the mating season and slowly digesting the massive quantities of meat that it gorged upon before its each hibernation period. When the days begin to shorten and the warmth of the sun retreats once again, Thundertusk will gradually raise its heartbeat and exert maximum effort upon the glacier around it. Eventually, through sheer brawn and with numerous shifts of its massive shoulders and muscular haunches, the Thundertusk will burst free in a shower of ice shards and roar its victory over the sun. Hungry beyond measure, it will rampage over the mountainsides, generating a shimmering chill that numbs the air. Thundertusks use their great tusks to scoop up any living creatures that they can find, tossing them into the air and catching them in their blunt maws to devour. When they meet on the mountainous slopes, ogres and Thundertusks eye each other warily. For a strong meat-gathering party or highly skilled hunter are some of the few predators that can actually bring down such a beast. Slaying Thundertusk is a great boon to a hungry tribe, but slaying one is no easy business. Thundertusks are known to crush, gouge, and freeze their way through most attacks. Just occasionally, though, a tribe will manage to bring low an injured Thundertusk, and, by the use of iron chains the thickness of an ogre's forearm, stout clubs, and copious quantities of red meat, they can train the beast. Captured Thundertusks are kept in chains and dragged about for a long time, but can eventually coexist alongside the Ogre tribes, and can even be broken in to permit a few riders to sit upon their enormously broad shoulders. Thus a Thundertusk will join a tribe, becoming a living engine of frozen destruction. These massive mounts give the ogres that ride them an extra 20 tons of brute force to smash things with, an excellent view of the battlefield, and also an ice-cold walking larder with which to keep their meat fresh. In battle, the Thundertusks are used to blast the foe with ranged attacks and to lend support to the main ogre battle line. Towering high above the heads of all but the tallest combatants, the Thundertusk and its crew unleash a hail of fire even as they advance upon the foe. A Thundertusk will often aim to crash into the enemy lines at the same time as the bulk of the ogre attack, supporting their bone-crunching charge with its own chilling aura of frozen doom. So it's kind of like a mix between a Cygor and a Frostdrake, and I'll explain why. The Frostdrake, because it has a special rule called Numbing Chill. Any enemy unit within 6 inches of the Thundertusk has the Always Strike Last special rule. So, same thing as the Frostdoor, same thing we get with the Frostheart Phoenix, something that slows things down, maybe even reducing its melee attack so it can't hit as often. Now, in addition to that, it also has, it's got Smooth Ride, so it can basically move and shoot, but not in the same way that we would think of things that move and shoot simultaneously in Total War Warhammer. I think that it probably still has its same characteristics we see with the Ironblaster and the Scrap Launcher. I would expect that as well. But it has something called the Sphere of Frost-Wreathed Ice. The Thundertusk can make a stone thrower shooting attack with the following profile. This attack may be made even if the Thundertusk moves, but not if it marches. So that's where I kind of see the Cygor ability here, right? Where you're chucking these huge, rather than rocks, chunks of ice down range that just do a crap ton of damage. It doesn't have the longest range, but again, I expect this thing to kind of slowly prod its way down range, causing terror and having a numbing kind of chill aura effect, and shooting these huge boulders or glaciers of ice at targets that are just going to do a mass amount of, I would just say, anti-infantry damage. It doesn't have a huge strength value. It probably just is just going to be an anti-infantry just bomb onto things. So no actual AP. I think the real big thing of this is it's going to be a support engine, very similar to the way that the Norskins have their War Shrine support engine. And it's funny how the War Shrine grants fire attacks, if I remember correctly. And this thing, while not granting fire attacks, does have a bunch of ice attacks. So I find that pretty interesting. I don't know if it would have weakness to fire because it doesn't have that as a special rule, but the lore would definitely make it out to be that it does not like anything from the lore of fire. It kind of makes it sound like it wouldn't even like things from the lore of light, but I think the lore of fire might have some additional effects on the Thundertusks, as it were, because this thing is a pretty awesome little beast of war, and like I said, it is a dual kit with the Stonehorn. It does have the riders on it carry chain traps and harpoon launchers on the Thundertusk, so kind of think of this thing as having basically a Hadab where it can shoot while it's charging in close, outside of its own Sphere of Frost-Wreathed Ice abilities. So again, I think this will be a really fun unit in the same way that the Stonehorn will, but the Stonehorn I look at more of as a close combat unit. The Thundertusk I look at more of as a ranged unit that has close combat supporting effects. And at that, we are at the end of our Ogre Kingdom's army list. It has been a doozy. I know this one's been a pretty dense one as far as some of the lore entries, and I'll be honest, even going through it, I had forgotten how a lot of these are almost a page and a half long, and I was like, shit, hope people don't mind. So it's going to be an interesting army to see in Total War Warhammer 3, because everything has got this main mechanic that is based off of charging. Charge bonuses, I think, are going to be the name of the game when it comes to Ogre Kingdom. Even their artillery pieces are about charging. I think that's going to be the coolest thing about them, is that you're not going to have the conventional need to threaten a backline when you're fighting the Ogre Kingdom. You're really going to be wanting to shore up as much charge defense versus large or all that you can when you're fighting against them. And I think that'll make for a very interesting way to build out armies against these guys. Because like I said, in tabletop, the only way to really beat these guys as high elves was to take the lore of death. So you had the Purple Son of Xerius, you had Occam's Mindrazor. These things were so important to taking down the ogres. And just so you guys know, the Purple Son of Xerius, the way it worked was everything that the sun touched had to make an initiative check, which basically means you roll a die and you look at your initiative. If it's if it's your initiative or higher, then you're fine. But ogres have initiative of like 1 or 2. So basically, you drop a Purple Sun Azirius on like a unit of Ironguts, you delete the whole entire unit. That was really the only way to combat these guys effectively, was to take out their chunkier, heavier units with spells, and then focus down their individual characters with your elite cav or your elite archers and such. So they were a very challenging army on the tabletop for certain armies. Other armies had a better chance of just smashing them outright. It just depended on, like dwarves, for example, had so many cannons that they could really threaten them very, very hand and fist, especially with, or beard and fist, especially with thunderers and the such. So it really kind of depends who you were playing in tabletop. But overall, I think this is going to be a very interesting and a very different army for Total War Warhammer 3, and I'm really excited to see how this makes that translation into the game. If you guys have any questions about this, please by all means let me know below. For those of you guys that played Ogre Kingdoms, feel free to comment on some certain things that you want to talk about more about the army. I personally, it's one of the only armies of Warhammer Fantasy that I never collected. I only had the army book for them, and I've never had a single model of theirs. So if you want to expand on anything, please by all means do that. I'm more than happy to hear what you have to say about it. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. If you want to hear more about the Ogre Legendary Lords or the magic, you should see that linked at the very end of this video. You'll see a link to all the Ogre Kingdoms army, or all the Ogre Kingdoms lore that I've created thus far. But again, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one, and take care.